What's up? I'm Jared Welch. Aaron Halterman. When is today? Thursday, April 27th, and this is Blinkers Off, the last Thursday before the week of the Derby. So naturally, we're going to have our friend Jon White on here in a little bit. But how are you, and where the hell are you?
Yeah, I'm back at Uncle Vito's bar here in New York. People that have been on the channel today have seen some entertaining shows. I don't know if they were good or bad, but they were entertaining. And so now we're going to see an even better one, though, with Jon White. Can't wait, man. It's going to be fun. And like I said, I can't believe it's time for the Jon White interview. It's nuts.
I was going back through. I always do this every time it comes up. Go back and look at like our old ones, and
Yeah.
I look at my I always have like a put together a list of kind of like what we want to talk about and just think what the title of the show and stuff. And I mean all the way back, I think it was like 17 or 16 was the first one, 16, 17, somewhere in there.
Mm-hmm.
But man, yeah, it just gets better and better every year. I'm interested this year though, because it feels like a lot of the time, especially recently, I feel like we all kind of, well, last year especially with Table. I don't want to remind ourselves of that too much, but where we align very well. And this year, I don't know that we're all going to align very well here.
Yeah, that's okay. I think that's the beauty of horse racing. You get people together and they can have different opinions, and then they go to the window. And as D. Wayne Lucas always said, people have opinions. The horses have the facts, and that is never going to change. The horses are going to have the facts, and we're going to find out. But you're right. A lot of years we are on the same horses. We may be similar-ish. We'll see when he comes on here today. But I've been following his top 10. We might be a little different. Yeah, listen. I think it was Nyquist the first year we had him on, and in 16, and I felt decent about Nyquist, and then I left that show and I thought, all right, he's the pick, and so that's what I usually get with the show. So it'll be interesting to see if he can convince me to take a couple of these horses. So another great year, man, for this Derby. And this is another year, we don't have American Pharoah. We don't have Justify. We need a Jon White to tell us what to do here and kind of help us out.
Kevin wants us to make sure I ask Jon if Cohen's pick of Justify, if he think he can win the Derby. That is every time I ask him who's going to win, it's Justify. So we'll ask Jon what he thinks of Justify. If Justify was in this year, like how confident? Like I feel like it'd be the easiest bet like of all time. If you had a Justify, if you had a Pharoah, we talked about this in the last couple of weeks where that speed horse. You just had someone in here like Justify. I mean, my goodness, it would make things make things a little more simple.
Sure would. And it is well, listen, we'll wait for Jon, but just a little spoiler. It is a race where it feels like if there was that kind of speed horse that you could really back, you'd be like, all right, yeah, reverse slam dunk. We're going with this horse that's got the speed. But the horses that do have that speed, they kind of have some issues or some question marks. Maybe not issues, might be a little too strong, but question marks. So that's kind of what makes this puzzle a little different than some of the puzzles we tried to put together here in the Kentucky Derby. But that's all right, and that makes for good content and good betting.
All right, well, let's not waste any time here because it feels like no one's here to see us. It's one of the. I mean, let's be honest. It's probably the way it is most of the weeks we do it. They're here for maybe what we're going to talk about, but they're not here to see us. They are here to see our good friend Jon White. So today's show, we are going to take a closer look at the Kentucky Derby and obviously look what Jon thinks. He does the San Anita and Del Mar morning lines. He does the Breeders' Cup when it's out there. He's a long-time horse racing journeyman. I mean, surely by now you guys know who Jon White is. If you don't, educate yourself. Hopefully, watching us, you'll find out. But he's going to give us thoughts on the 2023 Kentucky Derby. You're kind of just, that's what's great about these is we kind of roundtable this and we just kind of talk about what our opinions are and what we think and what Jon's thinking and, some of the strongest bets he likes, some of the favorite long shots he might like in this year's Kentucky Derby. Let's go.
All right.
All right. Without further ado, let's bring in our good friend of the show, one of our great longtime friends, Mr. Jon White. What's up, man?
He's saying he can't hear us.
Can't hear us?
Yeah. Just got the message.
Uh-oh.
Well, come back and come back in, maybe.
Here, let's get you out here. Let's see. Kick from studio. Let's try that.
Okay.
Let me invite him again. So last year we did this. We recorded it, and then we just shot it. And then this year, and it went so well. We're like, hey, let's do this live.
And he was perfect.
It was.
Yeah.
Heard him.
Like his audio was good, his video was good, and now it's that. So here we are.
Maybe we can just have. Can we have him sign? Does he know sign language?
Johnny says, "The man, the myth, the legend, the mute."
Kevin said, "I heard him."
Well, this is fun for the course on our shows today. They've been off the rails, so we shall see what happens here.
It's weird. Like we talked before we went live,
yes.
and it was perfect. Fine. We had him on here.
Everything was perfect. Do you want me to do a dance while we wait?
I want you to. What are the news? By the way, we got word, and we know John's a fan of Skinner. The news, Jack, that Skinner would be in. We're like, all right, well, I know we're gonna be talking about this horse today now that he's in the gate. Of course, a terrible situation with why he's in the gate. Well, there he is.
There he is. Now let's see. Can you hear us?
Yes. I missed everything you've said during the whole intro.
It was all terrible stuff.
I mean, I basically just said everything nice possible I could about you, John. So,
well, this whole thing reminds me of when I left the Daily Racing Form in 1993, after starting there in 1974, and I went into television at Santa Anita, and I knew that I needed to pick the brains of somebody that was very experienced in broadcasting. So I asked Kurt Hoover, who I would be working with on television from the, during the day, broadcasting from the walking ring there at Santa Anita. So we go out to Stuart Anderson's Black Angus, where I've been with the dudes, with you guys.
Yep.
We had a really nice dinner. And one of the most important questions I asked Kurt was, what do I need to know? I just started off. What do I need to know broadcasting? He said, the first thing I'm going to tell you is be ready for anything at any time. Here we are in 2023 from 1993. And what he meant was the technical difficulties and everything. And I was trying to read you guys' lips, but I'm not very good at that. So unfortunately, I missed the whole intro.
So you didn't know when you got on here that we were actually signing this whole show. This was actually.
Okay.
we thought you were familiar with that. All right, now let's try it again. Jon White has joined us for a Kentucky Derby 149. John, first of all, thanks for joining us. Thanks for being on the show. I mean, obviously, at this point, we don't even ask you to be on. We just tell people John will be on, and then about a week before, you say, hey, here's my schedule, and we just get you on. So thanks for joining, and thanks for doing this every year with us.
Well, we've been doing it for quite a few years. I won't say it's a tradition like no other, because that's already taken, but it is a pretty good tradition that we have put together. We've been doing it for quite a while now. And so, it's kind of nice. Traditions are nice, and this is certainly one of them. By the way, I was talking about when I first went to work for the Daily Racing Form. That was in 1974, so 49 years ago. And kind of this whole way we started off this broadcast, my first day for the Racing Form, I was introduced to the chart caller, who was actually the national field supervisor and called the charts for 20 Kentucky Derbies, including the 1974 Kentucky Derby that had the record 23 horse field. His name was Bud Lyon. And he had started in the Pacific Northwest, and then he ended up in Florida calling it Hialeah, and Hialeah was a big deal, Gulfstream. This was even, he predated Calder, but then he was there at Calder. But he became the national field supervisor. And so he liked what I brought to the table. I gave him a resume, this and that. And so after about a couple of weeks, he says, we're going to put you to work. So you got to report to the racing office tomorrow morning. So I'm an eager kid just out of high school, basically, 1974. And so I go into the racing office, and the guy working with him, Wilbur Brook, had been with the racing firm by that time, like almost 30 years, a very experienced guy. And so Wilbur was sitting at the teletype machine. That shows you how far this goes back. Not the computer, the teletype machine. As he would send in the entries, all the racing information, owners, trainers, and he was sitting there sending in the workout tab from that morning. And so I was just standing there observing him, and I happened to look at the tab that had been given to him by the official clocker. And I see a name on there for like a 4 furlong workout. And I pointed to this horse, and I told Wilbur very meekly, I mean, I'm my first day on the job with the Daily Racing Forum. I'm not going to be, like a know-it-all or anything, but I wanted to be helpful. So I said, Wilbur, if I were you, I would not send in the workout for that horse. And he starts yelling at me. Who are you to be telling me not to send this workout in for this horse? These are the official workouts, and you're telling me to not do this? I'm not going to listen to you. Forget it. I mean, and I said, no, I'm sorry. I was just trying to help. So he went back to typing in the workouts. And after about a couple of minutes, he turns around and he says, well, just out of curiosity, why did you tell me not to send this workout in? I said, well, you can never be 100% sure, but I'm as close to 100% sure as you can possibly be. I said, the workout you're sending in is for Little Current, winner of this year's Preakness and Belmont Stakes. And I don't think he worked 4 furlongs today at Playfair Racecourse.
No.
And he said, oh, maybe I won't send that in. And I said, well, was kind of my thought. So, I spent the rest of the morning. I go home. I come back the next morning. I walk into our room in the racing office adjacent. We had our own we were in the same room as the publicity director. I walked in. He said, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I said, for what? He says, for telling me not to send that workout in. And I said, well, you're welcome. And he says, I said, why was it on there? And he said, the guy that trained the actual horse just gave him that name to see if it would end up in the racing form. As if it hadn't been for you, that workout of Little Current would have shown up in the racing form.
That's fantastic.
And that's my first day working in racing 49 years ago.
That's something I would do, like try to, hey, see if we can get this horse in the workout tab.
Yeah, that was an errand type thing for sure. Absolutely.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. Well, to that point, let's see if we can get maybe Little Current's not working out this week, but maybe we can find out a horse that might be running next week in the Kentucky Derby. And of course, here we are a week away, really. I mean, by this time next week, we obviously will know the field, the draw, the post positions, all that good stuff. But, going into it now, week out, I think it's very clear. It's very evident. Forte is the horse. I mean, he's the deserving favorite. He will be the favorite. I think I've heard been all over. I've heard 5-2. I've heard 7-2, 3-1, somewhere in that department. Where are you at with Forte, and how concerned are you, in fact, of the quote unquote declining numbers, or has it, maybe he hasn't improved from a 2 to a 3? Like all along, it kind of felt like a Nyquist year up until recently, where it was like, Nyquist just stayed better than everybody, and that group that year wasn't all that good. And it kind of felt like Forte was doing the same thing, but now all of a sudden you've got some horses like Tapit Trice or King's Barnes or Practical Move or whoever you like that do seem to be kind of catching up to Forte. So how concerned are you with Forte as a favorite of the Kentucky Derby?
Well, one of the most interesting aspects of this year's Kentucky Derby is that you can go up and down the line, and you can have things you're going to like about a horse. And there's even whoever you like, there's going to be something not to like too. everybody in this race. It really makes it, but that's why to me Forte is a very good horse to bet against. Now I was mentioning that 1974 was my first year with the racing form. 1973 in my high school paper, I wrote in March 22nd, I dare say, because I wrote a sports column in my high school paper, and there was a lot of horse racing coverage that came into that sports column. And on March 22nd, I wrote, I dare say that 1973 will be a historic year as Secretariat will become the first Triple Crown winner since the Great Citation in 1948. You know, you guys live, you know, we have experienced that 37-year Triple Crown drought. That 25-year drought was pretty good too. And at that time, a lot of people thought we're never going to see another Triple Crown winner. And Secretariat, even Secretariat, there were a lot of knockers because of his breeding. A lot of people felt there's no way a Bold Ruler can win the 1.25 mile Kentucky Derby. They felt that no son of Bold Ruler could win the Derby at that distance. Well, of course, Secretariat broke the track record. He won the Preakness, and it took him years, but he finally got his credit due for running the fastest Preakness. And then, of course, his Belmont, probably the greatest performance by a thoroughbred in American history, 31 lengths, 224 flat. And that's how he did it 1.5 miles. People thought he couldn't go 1.25 miles. Look what he did at 1.5 miles. The thing about Forte is, you know, Secretariat was the horse of the year as a 2-year-old. By the way, I'm wearing a Secretariat hat. I don't know if you can see it,
Yep.
but Secretariat was the horse of the year as a 2-year-old. And the thing about 2-year-olds to 3-year-olds, and you guys know this now too, you guys have been in this game long enough to know, if you're good at 2, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be as good at 3, and vice versa. You know, a lot of times we see the horses that weren't all that good at 2 blossom, and they become very good at 3. I mean, take a look at a horse like Charismatic. Here's a horse in 1999 that kind of struggled here in California. People make a big deal that he actually once ran in a claiming race. It was a maiden claiming race. Somebody could have claimed the horse. Nobody wanted him. And he came, but when he left California, he went to the Lexington Stakes, which in those days was run closer to the Kentucky Derby than it is now. And his buyer figures went through the roof. And back then, I was just kind of really starting to get into these buyers, because before the buyers, all we had in the racing form were speed ratings. And those things weren't worth much at all. The buyers were such an improvement from the daily racing form speed ratings that it took a while before I, you know, put that much credence in the buyers. And of course, now we have the Thorograph that are even better, and the Regazin. But with Charismatic, he went to the Lexington and got this huge triple-digit buyer speed figure, and then he duplicated that figure in the Kentucky Derby. And I made a huge bet on him in the Preakness because I did not think that his Derby was a fluke. Why? Because of the big race before the Derby. See, that was the key. He didn't just hop up and run a big race in the Derby. He ran a big race before the Derby and verified that in the Derby. So that's why I hammered him in the Preakness, and he paid good because as a Kentucky Derby winner, he wasn't even the favorite. He paid really good that day. And unfortunately, you know, he hurt himself in the Belmont, and there went his Triple Crown, but he was still the 1999 Horse of the Year. So with Forte, is he a 2-year-old? You know, to you guys, do you feel that he has moved forward, or is he the same, or has he gone backwards? See, these buyers to me are troubling. And they're particularly troubling because I took the time the other day to look this up as far as the buyers during the buyer speed figure era, since they first went into the racing form. And only one horse has gone into the Kentucky Derby with this pattern of Forte's, to where he ran a buyer, then declined, then went into the Derby. And that was Street Sense. And then he perked way up and ran a big figure in the Kentucky Derby. See, he had a cagey old-time trainer. And that's something that you have to take into consideration for races like the Kentucky Derby. I know you guys scoff at Skinner a lot, but one of the things about Skinner that fools a lot of people is John Sheriffs is a trainer cut from the mold of a Charlie Whittingham type guy that could pick up target and have this horse at their absolute best for the target. You know, Charlie Whittingham think of all the stakes winners that guy trained in his life. He won with very few first-time starters. It was tremendously rare. Sunday Silence didn't win his first race. Ferdinand didn't win his first race. I mean, you just hardly ever saw it with Charlie. Why? Because as he trained horses, they would give a horse a race. Sometimes it was, and you guys will like this and appreciate this, sometimes it was the bet on the horse. Seriously. Charlie wasn't adverse to stepping up and putting money on a horse. And Shoemaker was involved in that himself. And that's why Shoemaker would be on a horse and they would just basically give him the race. And they knew that like next time out, or maybe 2 times after the debut, this horse would be ready to roll and his price would be better. So you had to watch Charlie closely with his style. That style's gone, you know, out of fashion. Nobody does that hardly anymore. John Sheriffs does, but very few. Richard Mandela would be another trainer of that ilk. That's why Go Rocket Ride, when he won his career debut, got a big buyer in that race. It was a huge sign. That's the type of thing that when you saw Charlie Whittingham do something like that, it really got your attention. Bob Baffert, he wins with first-time starters all the time. You know, Todd Pletcher does too. I mean, the modern trainers, because nowadays trainers can't afford basically to give a horse a race because it hurts their win percentages. And back in the 70s and 60s and 70s and 80s, before they put these trainers' win percentage in the form, it was more important for a trainer to be the leading trainer at a track than have a big percentage. Once those percentages went in, suddenly trainers realized people were looking at that, whether you were a low percentage trainer or a high percentage trainer. And the high percentage trainers tended to get more horses. And so fewer and fewer guys would come along and just say, well, you know, I'm not going to crank him for his first race. Nowadays, for the most part, they can't afford to get the knock down that percentage. So with John Sheriffs, that's the thing. Look at Giacomo. I mean, how he was brought along and just let him come along. Did he win the Santa Anita Derby? No. Honor AP didn't win the Kentucky Derby, but ran a good race in it. Did he, you know, and he did win the Santa Anita Derby, beating the Kentucky Derby winner. But John Sheriffs, it doesn't bother me. Let me tell you how huge it was for Zenyatta on Thanksgiving Day when she made her debut at Hollywood Park. How huge a sign that was. Not only did Zenyatta win her first race, but it was at 6.5 furlongs. Think of that. It showed how great she was, because I guarantee you, Sheriffs didn't even have her remotely cranked for that race, particularly sprinting. That was a means towards an end. It was a race to get her ready for her 2-turn race. And she not only won, she won with authority, and she beat a highly regarded other filly in that race. And that was a big sign of what she was. Let me just step aside for a second. When Zenyatta was running in a stakes race early in her career, not long after that maiden win, I got into the press elevator at Santa Anita with Mike Mitchell, who was running against Zenyatta in this stakes race at Santa Anita. We started on the ground floor. Mike was going to get off at the mezzanine, and I was going to go on up to the press box. As we're going up, Mike says, "What do you think of that Sheriff's filly?" And at that time, she'd only run like 2 or 3 times. You know, she hadn't hardly run. But I already knew, based off that debut win alone, what we might be dealing with here. And he says, "I think she's overrated." And I said, you know, and you don't really, I don't want to overly disagree with him. He's a guy I'm going to interview a lot and everything, but I got to be honest. And I said, well, Mike, I just have to tell you, I think she's the real deal. And that's like a verbatim quote. And the door opened and he went, and he goes, "We'll see." And he walked out. And of course, Zenyatta, as you know, she didn't lose. She won her first 19 races. So I happened to get in the elevator the next day again, and Mike Mitchell was in it. And a lot of guys would have said, see, and I wasn't even going to bring it up. And he goes, well, you were right. And he says, I'm going to tell you something. I'm not in any hurry to run against her again anytime soon. And believe me, the filly that Mike Mitchell ran against her was a nice, she was a stakes winner going into that race. Zenyatta wasn't. And he goes, I'm not in any hurry to run anybody against her anymore. And when Zenyatta won the Vanity later in her career, one of her victories, John Sheriff's, I wasn't there that day, but my wife was covering the race for Blood Horse magazine. And the fact that she told me this was so amazing to me, because Zenyatta looked like she was going to get beat. And she just got up to beat this Mike Mitchell horse. And when the horses were coming back to the winner's circle, Mike Mitchell was standing there and applauding the horse that had just beaten him.
Wow.
And that, how often do you see that? And I asked Mike later about that, and he says, I had to salute her, because he says, I thought I had her beat for sure. And believe me, if you had live in-race betting at the top of the stretch, you'd bet everything on Mike Mitchell's runner in that race. And she got beat. And, that was like years after Mike Mitchell said, I'm not in any hurry to run against her again. And it was a long time before he did. But he had the appreciation for Zenyatta to stand there and be applauding for her. So the thing about Forte is, I'm very suspicious of him. Either it's the distances getting longer. See, that kind of is an illusion to be in the Florida Derby, because if you break down the time, and you got to be careful with the times at Gulfstream, because they're not exactly the most accurate things we've ever come up with in mankind. But going on the times that we have, she didn't come home all that fast. Back on Zenyatta. He didn't come home all that fast, and he beat Mage. Now, Mage ran a fantastic race considering how lightly raced he is, and the tremendous move he made on the far turn. But Mage hit a wall late in that race, to me. I mean, he was out of gas.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it somewhat of an illusion of what Forte was doing in that race. I mean, you don't want to be too hard on Forte. He's only lost once. He was a 3-time Grade 1 winner as a 2-year-old. He's won the 2 major preps in Florida this year, the Fountain Youth and the Florida Derby. And he's the type of horse you mouth off about, and then he wins the race and you look like an idiot. So, I mean, I'm just saying, considering that I agree with you, Jared, I think he'll be the favorite. As such, I think he is a vulnerable favorite because of these declining buyers and the fact that, I'm just not blown away by what I've seen from him so far this year. I think a lot of these horses, like Practical Move, like Tapit Trice, and a number of others, could run by a tiring Mage. So, and see, the number didn't come back and they even look, the number looked bad when it started at 98, and it came down to 95. So he didn't even run as good as it seemed at first. So Forte, to me, it's partly why I like this Derby a lot, because it's not every Derby that you can sit here with a horse with the record of Forte and be sitting here feeling not confident. I don't think you can be totally confident of practically anything in this Derby, which is what's making it so interesting. Like with Secretariat going into the Kentucky Derby, I was confident, even though 2 weeks earlier he'd been upset in the Wood Memorial. But I thought the slow pace beat him in the Wood Memorial. Now, then they came out and said he had an abscess. Whether it was the pace, an abscess, whatever. The thing about Secretariat was, going into the Wood Memorial, he'd finished first in 10 straight. His only loss during that sequence was a disqualification in the Champagne, which probably wouldn't even be a disqualification the way races are judged today. So he really was that close to having 10 straight wins into the Derby. I mean, I wasn't going to jump ship off the one race. And so I was very confident, not only that Secretariat would win the Kentucky Derby, I still thought he'd win the Triple Crown, which he did do. But I don't see how you can be totally confident in anybody. As I said, everybody in this race, you could look at them and say, yeah, I like this, and I like that. But there's this to worry about, I mean, for everybody. So Forte to me, I had him ranked in like my top 2 or 3 pretty much all the way until that Florida Derby. And it's hard to believe off a win that you would knock him down, but that's why I've moved him down to 5th, because I think there's 4 horses I would try to beat him with in terms of this year's Derby.
But side note, that was 2010 Vanity. St. Trinian's was the horse. And
St. Trinian's.
I remember Halterman and I were together. I remember where we were at, what we were doing. We were with you, John. She was beat. There's no way. Like, she finally got it. And mind you, like you said it, she was a good horse. I mean, St. Trinian's was like 2-1 in that race. You know, like, she was bet. And it was, and Zenyatta was like 1-2. Like, she was actually playable. One of the few times, you know, that she was. And yeah, she was beat. She was totally beat. And St. Trinian's had that weird running style where she kind of like hiked the leg out. Yeah.
Yep. Well, I think Zenyatta was giving her a fair amount of weight that day too. I want to say
she was. Yeah, I about fell out of the chair. I thought that day and the day at Del Mar that she barely got up against. I don't remember what year that was. Those were the 2 where I thought she's not going to do it today. But that was that was unbelievable.
So you guys would like this. I remember exactly where I was for that race. It's a place we've been together on many occasions. I was at Matt Denny's. I'd gotten off the air on HRTV and I stopped off at Matt Denny's and I was sitting there. And on top of this, I had St. Trinian's in my fantasy league.
Oh,
so I was sitting there at the top of the stretch going, well, one thing about it, I don't have Zenyatta in my league, but I'm going to beat her right here and right now. Nope. No, it was, but that of just picturing that of him standing there as Zenyatta, and of course the crowd was going nuts because by then Zenyatta was, you know, one of the most popular racehorses we've ever had in this country. I mean, profiled on 60 Minutes and so forth. But as she's coming back, the crowd's going crazy. There's the trainer who just got beat in the photo, standing and applauding for Zenyatta. Just being told that's so memorable to me.
Just something we'll never. I mean, at least maybe we will, but just like that was something that the prime. I mean, obviously she's the horse in our logo. I mean, like was such an influence on what we are now and what we got into it, and I just don't know that we'll ever match that.
Well, Jared, we have a similar story. If you remember, the second time she came to the Apple Blossom, Dwayne Lucas had Be Fair. Remember Be Fair that ran in that race? They were trying to find anybody to run. Do you remember in the paddock, Lucas never took his eyes off Zenyatta the whole time she was circling around that paddock? And Papa Dude was with us, and he said, look at this, boys. He goes, that guy has seen every good horse imaginable, and he can't take his eyes off that horse. And we were like, wow, he can't. And he just followed her the whole way around. And so that, similar to John's story, it's just people that don't react like this, they did to her. So it was that, that's gives me chills just thinking about it now.
Well, part of the reason I was kind of excited to maybe knock off Zenyatta with St. Trinian's was, you talked about the Apple Blossom. I had Ginger Punch in my league when Zenyatta ran in the Apple Blossom the first time. Yeah, I had the defending Eclipse Award champion in the division.
Yeah.
And my bad luck in my fantasy league is such, how often does John Sheriff ship horses out of here? Not all that often. And he picks that race for Zenyatta to send her to the Apple Blossom. And Ginger Punch, I think, got pneumonia by how fast Zenyatta went by her on the floor. I mean, I'm sitting there going, well, so much for that, because that's a big deal in my league. It's our first bonus race where it's worth 2 grade 1s. And I'm sitting there going into it thinking, I've got a very good chance with Ginger Punch. No, forget that. It was like, no.
Yeah, that was a memorable one as well, for sure. Hey, one thing I wanted to point out, I had cheated. I knew about the buyer speed thing because I'd heard you on Steve Bick. I think you were on talking about it, and our buddy Ryan and I, he actually called me and we were talking about it with the street sense thing. I was digging deeper into this. Yes, he had declining buyers, but he ran at Tampa for his first race, which is a quirky track, right?
That's right.
Then he went to the Bluegrass, but
Yep.
that was when Keeneland had a synthetic surface. So there could be excuses made. Hey, the synthetic surface may not have been to his liking. Hey, that Tampa track may not have been to his liking. So even though you're 100% correct, that's a bigger, let's say, excuse than what Forte has had. So I found that interesting.
That is very interesting, Aaron. And on top of that, I will piggyback on that because again, it's that's an old school trainer. That guy, Nafsker, that's a guy that isn't going to be worried about Unbridled losing a race on the way to the Derby or Street Sense losing a race on the way to the Derby. How many trainers, are of that ilk today? See, that's the thing about John Sheriff's. And see, he's kind of over here by himself in that regard. Look at how many of these preps Todd Pletcher wins, Brad Cox wins, and so forth. And listen, I'm not criticizing, they've won Derbies, so it's not like that's not a way to do it. But what I'm saying is you've got to be careful in terms of underestimating. It's easy to underestimate a Charlie Whittingham. See, once he keeps doing this to you, after a while you go, okay, I've been down this road enough times, I get it. And that's the same thing as a NASCAR or a Sheriff's, to where you don't want to put too much stock on the way to the big goal with that type of trainer. And there aren't many of them, but NASCAR's one of them, and so is Sheriff's. So that's very interesting what you say about that, Aaron. See, I know with NASCAR, he wasn't that worried about whatever basically Street Sense did on the way to the Derby. But he was the type of guy that would have him ready to, completely primed on that first Saturday of May. And another thing that helped Street Sense, he liked Churchill. I was at that Breeders' Cup, and he loved that surface. I mean, he won that Breeders' Cup, by 10, if I remember correctly. And so two of the best races of his entire career were on that track. That's another thing about Churchill. Remember about Rich Strike. As much as an anomaly people feel that was for him to win the Derby, he'd run a big race at Churchill.
Yeah.
And the thing about Rich Strike, I will say, while he's being denigrated these days, and to some extent he hasn't won since the Kentucky Derby, he had a number of triple-digit buyer speed figures when getting beat last year. So it wasn't like he stunk up the joint. I mean, he wasn't like some, it was some horrible horse or whatever. I mean, did everything fall right for him on that day? Yes. And that's how oftentimes a winner of the Kentucky Derby, it happens. Listen, when Point Given left Santa Anita in 2001, I mean, when he won the Santa Anita Derby, I was sitting right next to Kurt Hoover, that guy that I was picking his brain at a restaurant to try to learn about broadcasting. And I looked over at Kurt and I said, he's going to win the Triple Crown. I mean, I wasn't saying he's going to win the Derby. I was saying he's going to win the Triple Crown. And he doesn't even run 1, 2, 3 in the Kentucky Derby.
Yeah.
But I loved him in the Preakness because I knew that Derby was the aberration, because that horse, what I believe happened to him that day more than anything, he drew into the second gate. And back then, that was like considered death. As years went by and we kept getting the 19 and 20 horse fields, more and more horses were winning out of that second gate. But at that time, it was like considered a death knell. If you were not in the first 14, if you were in that past that, so few had won. And Point Given was a big horse like Zenyatta. You guys talked about Zenyatta. She was so big, and so was Point Given. Two of the biggest top horses I was ever around. And Point Given was the type, and believe me, Zenyatta was this way too. You had to let her settle into stride. The way Gary Stevens rode Point Given in that Derby would be like if he had been on Zenyatta in any of her races, and he's riding her like a quarter horse in the first part of the race. And Gary Stevens was really pumping, trying to get Point Given into a good tactical position, and this completely flummoxed him. I mean, it didn't work because it got him totally off his game, totally off his comfort, out of his comfort zone. You go back and watch that Derby, watch Gary Stevens in the run to that first turn. Then go to the Preakness and watch, because I was very confident once, we weren't worried about the post position and this and that. Stevens just got him out of the gate, let him settle, and he just wins easy. And of course, I thought he was an even bigger cinch in the Belmont, and he won that by, a block. One of the best Belmonts you'll ever see. And so, it's so important to know how these horses are ridden and everything. And that was the case with Point Given, was that he was a horse as good as he was. You could, if you rode him wrong, it would backfire. That's, to me, what happened in the Kentucky Derby.
Well, that's a good segue. I wanted to talk about Derma, but we'll talk about him in a second. It's a good segue into a horse that I think we can all agree. I think, by the way, we all three, this might be one of the few of the podcasts. I think we're all on the same page with Forte. Really good. Like him. He's deserving favorite, but definitely a play against based off of the value. So the stablemate, Tapit Trice, a horse that obviously I'm hoping wins for fantasy purposes, but I love this horse. I've been following this horse all year. He's one, to me, you talk about how key it is to ride him the right way. And we've seen with the last two, especially with Lee Saez. I mean, last time was a lot better. Tampa Bay, he had to ride the shit out of him the whole time. So how important is the break with, obviously 20 horses, we'll see where he draws. We want, that's all next week. But I mean, for a horse that has seemingly just gets better as the race goes, how important is that first, quarter mile, that first time they go past you to get Tapit Trice in that position? Like you said with Gary Stevens, pumping on him, getting him in that spot. He's going to have to do that with Tapit Trice.
Jared, that's a very good question. I have more respect for Tapit Trice coming into this race than the 2-year-old champion Forte. I can't, and look, I don't blame anybody for betting on or picking Forte, because believe me, like I say, I'm not even remotely going to say he can't win, because believe me, he could win and head to the Preakness looking like maybe a horse capable of winning the Triple Crown. In other words, here I am trying to beat him in the Kentucky Derby, and after the Derby's over, you're going like, geez, this horse might actually have a shot to win all three. Because if he wins the Derby, that comes into play for sure.
Yep.
But going into the Derby, I have more respect for Tapit Trice. In fact, I would like. My brother will probably be in Vegas, and I may look to see if I can get a head-to-head matchup between Tapit Trice and Forte, because I would bet Tapit Trice head-to-head against Forte, because I feel more comfortable. I just think at this particular point, Tapit Trice is the better horse. I just do. Mm-hmm. That said, Tapit Trice is very tricky because of what you're talking about, Jared. And it's one reason I don't have him pick first or second. I have him pick third. I feel he's kind of one of these looks good to hit the board types that he'll come on. But see, I focus on that 1/8 of a mile to go factor so much. And he did well in the Bluegrass to do that, but I'm not confident he'll do that again in the Derby against this field and that big a field, against this quality of runners and the size of the field. And the problem that is handed here in terms of riding him is he kind of got away with pushing, getting him into the things better. It's one reason I respect him enough to pick him third. If he had run better than that in the Bluegrass, I wouldn't even pick him in like my top 5 again. But he showed enough improvement tactical wise from Tampa Bay. And you made the point, Aaron, and it's true. That Tampa Bay, that place is a really quirky place. You don't want to be too dogmatic on what any horse does over that track. That's for sure. And another thing Tapit Trice has going for him, this is not a strong Derby speed figure wise. The top figure is that, as far as we know, is a 101 for 2 fills, and that was on synthetic. It's way above his best figure on dirt. Then we have 100 for Forte, 200s for Practical Move, and 100 for Skinner. But then you have Tapit Trice at 99. So, I mean, he's knocking right. You're only splitting hairs there. And that's another thing I like about Tapit Trice. He brought his game up, right up to almost the triple-digit level. But I am very concerned about him, because if they ride him patiently early, which I think kind of he would prefer, honestly, to be more like Point Given and Zenyatta. But if you do that, you're at the mercy of the racing luck so much that they don't want to do that. So they're going to try hard, and especially after it worked in the Bluegrass. But I'll tell you what, I'm worried about Tapit Trice that last furlong again. I see him coming on to maybe be a threat at the top of the lane. And I think he might flatten out a little bit. And the reason I say that is not the distance, because I think the distance will be, off his breeding. And, a lot of people think he's the Belmont horse. I can't argue with that. The thing about the Belmont is it's not typically, won by the big closers. It's won by a horse kind of more tactical. He is a big closer, but I think the pace in the Belmont will just put him closer. And he'll still be able to have that kick. That's not the case in the Derby. They're so two different, animals, the Kentucky Derby and the Belmont. That's what makes sweeping the Triple Crown so special. And you guys have been through 2 of them now. It looked like we might never have another one. I was confident we'd had too many close calls, way too many, that I felt it was going to happen. And it happened with American Pharoah. It happened with Justify. But those are two, all 3 of these races are really so different that's for a horse to come along and be able to sweep them. I mean, it shows you how difficult it is and what a special horse it takes to do it. And Tapit Trice, I feel the Belmont is going to suit him better. I don't think this is the race that's going to suit him best. I really don't think he's too much of a good fit for the Preakness. So if he wins the Derby, he might be a horse again. I might be kind of licking my chops to go against in the Preakness Stakes, especially, with the horse of Cox's that just won First Mission. I like him a lot. They've got him at 15-1 in the morning line for the Preakness future bet. And believe me, if he's around 15-1, I'm betting that horse because I think he's a strong Preakness horse. I really do. That horse has got tremendous upside. He'll be fresh in the Preakness. He's got Cox. That's a big plus these days. That horse has a lot going for him. So if he's like around 15-1, I'm going to be watching that like a hawk because I will be involved in him around anything like 15-1. But Tapit Trice, look, I understand why anybody likes him. It's totally understandable. I mean, he's probably going to be the second favorite. I wouldn't even rule it out that he gives Forte a little bit of a run for his money for favoritism. I think there's going to be that much support for Tapit Trice, and he's on a winning streak. He sold for, so much money at public eye. I mean, there's just a lot to like about him. And I mean, he's got every right to win this race. I do have some concerns about him, but I respect him enough. I've got him at number 3 because I don't rank my Derby horses in terms of how I think the order of finish will be. I rank them in how I viewed their chances are to win the race. So to me, Tapit Trice going into it has the 3rd best chance to win the race. Forte has the 5th best chance to win the race.
So with that being said, we've talked about the closers, or a few of them there, and with Forte and Tapit Trice. You didn't hear the beginning of the show, but I was saying, look, this is a situation where if we had a speed horse you could really trust, boy, the pace kind of looks like it sets up to where it's ready for somebody that maybe not being right on the lead, but right there in that 1st, 2nd, or 3rd spot. Do you see it that way? And if so, who's that horse that's up front that can take him gate to wire maybe?
And part of what makes that tricky is the break.
Yeah.
because, and this is why I kind of laugh when people get so locked into figuring the pace scenario for the Kentucky Derby, because that can change so radically in an instant. I mean, you take a horse like that horse that Sadler had that won the Santa Anita Derby.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
he lost his who?
Rock Your World.
Rock Your World.
Yeah.
This race was over leaving the gate.
Yep.
I mean, it's just that simple. Looking at Lucky, who's another horse. That was my horse. I loved him in the Kentucky Derby. He drew the rail. My dad, my late father's telling me on the phone, Baffert should scratch it. I said, Dad, I don't think Bob Baffert is scratching the favorite for the Kentucky Derby just because he drew the rail. My dad says, well, he ought to, because that's probably going to, he says, I hope he doesn't get hurt. And when you watch how annihilated he got, he was lucky he didn't get hurt, really.
Yeah.
I mean,
He was,
and just, I bet with both hands on him in the Preakness. That's the thing about the Derby. A lot of times you can come out of that. You know, a Fleet Alex was another one that, even though I almost won that one with closing argument, you know, to me, I could kind of see the handwriting on the wall that a Fleet Alex was really the best horse in terms of that crop, probably. And, you know, then in the Preakness, when he almost fell, clipping heels, turning for home, I thought, well, so much for that idea. And then he was so good, he overcame that. And then I bet him big in the Belmont because of his breeding. We may get into that later because he shows up a Fleet Alex in the pedigree of one of these horses I'm sure we're going to talk about. But yes, the pace scenario was, I mean, that's one of the reasons I like Practical Move, because I think he is going to be in the first flight. And I think being in the first flight in this Derby, I think the winner will come from that first flight. I really do. Because that first flight is, with the way the pace probably will not be all that fast. And it is the Kentucky Derby, so it's not going to be like probably snail-like. But it's not going to be anything like last year, or that will really shock me. And if any horse tries to do that, they're just going to go out there and chuck it anyway. So, you know, but I think everybody after last year is going to have that prominent in their mind that they don't want to, because this is going to be talked about ad infinitum between now and the Kentucky Derby. All those jocks are going to be interviewed about the pace. And so I really want a horse that's going to be in that first flight. And that's a little bit of the problem I have with Tapit Trice. Now, maybe he's improving enough that he actually could end up, you know, if maybe not in the first flight, right off the first flight, or maybe even at the back of the first flight. I mean, I wouldn't rule that out because he's improving. So, I mean, I just worry about if they push him to do that, how much kick he'll have at the other end. You know, there's often a give and take on this. And on those come from behind type horses, if they're pushed early or too early sometimes, they don't have that same oomph at the end of the race. And that's just, it's a little bit, not a big concern with me with Tapit Trice, but it's a little bit of a, it's actually more of a concern with me with Forte.
Yep.
One thing I didn't mention about Forte that's actually an even bigger concern to me than his declining buyers, and that is he hasn't been first or second in his last two races coming into this at the 8th pole, and that's one of my strengths. And it's that strike system of why I liked Closing Argument. And I wrote about this. You can go back in the archives for Express Bet, but I wrote that Closing Argument. I'm picking him because I think he has not good, I said excellent chance to be first or second with an 1/8 of a mile to go. And he was first. And he led the whole final furlong till Giacomo nailed him right on the finish. And Giacomo got a just tremendous ride by Mike Smith, never had a straw in his path coming from way back. And if Giacomo has one little hiccup in that race, I would have had the winner at 71-1 odds. But it was the fact that Closing Argument projected to me. See, that was a Derby without a lot of early speed. It was similar to this one in that regard. And too many times people look at the Kentucky Derby worried so much, and look, it's understandable because they're all going farther than they've ever gone before. So the fact that they're going the 1.25 miles is not something to ignore, but I think it gets overemphasized a little bit. And the reason I do is because that eighth pole factor is so tried and true. Now, last year was one of the few exceptions. Rich Strike, he wasn't first or second at the eighth pole, but that's all the more reason I expect a return to normalcy this year, that we'll see the winner will probably be first or second with an eighth of a mile to go. And to me, there's that group of horses that we all can kind of project to be in that first flight. That's where I'm kind of honing in to find the winner. And it's one reason I've been knocking down Forte, is because I'm really concerned if he couldn't be first or second at the eighth pole in the Fountain Youth or the Florida Derby, and did not get a strike in my strikes, if he'd been first or second in either one, it didn't have to be both, just one of them. But the fact he wasn't first or second in both, and then when you look at that slow final furlong he ran, even though it looked like he was closing strong, but again, he was running past a very tired mage. So this is why, to me, I want somebody, whoever it's going to be, I want them in that first flight, because I think that first flight's going to be horses running comfortably enough that it's going to put them very much in the position to be first or second with a furlong to go.
So probably Kings Barnes, Derma, those would be two that are up there. Maybe Reincarnate, and then you're kind of thinking Practical Move kind of tracks those three. Is that kind of what you got in your head?
I think that's a fairly good scenario. But again, think of how, a messy break could change all that. Yes, as it would look going in. Even the Japanese horse, Derma is kind of a question mark, because they didn't want him on the lead in the UAE Derby. Yeah. They knew they had to go from the rail.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But going into that, now what's interesting to me is they're really in a quandary, because now what do they do? Really, what do they do? It worked for his biggest win he's ever had. Sending him worked. So the natural inclination is it worked. We don't want to not do what worked last time. So to me, and especially in a 20-horse field again, you think they're going to send him. He's not a rankish type horse, so I think they can send him and probably let him. I think if you will go to them and say, where would you like to be? I think they'd like to be second, third, fourth early, honestly.
Yeah.
It's one reason I'm sorry that Wild on Ice came out. I kind of thought he might be the early speed in this race. I thought he had a chance. He's kind of a bad gate horse, but if he'd gotten out of the gate, thought maybe he could be. I mean, it could be, in Kings Barnes, I know they don't want to be on the lead. People are so against him because of winning the Louisiana Derby on the front end. But this is something, as gamblers, you learn the hard way. You learn to take what most people think is a negative, and you see if you can turn it into a positive, or vice versa. And while people think it's a negative that Kings Barnes led all the way in Louisiana Derby, I actually look at it as a positive, because it was the first time he'd been in front early, and more than anything, he was asked to go 1 mile and 3/16 with one of the longest stretches in the world, with 2 races under his belt. And another thing about him, he's done this at 3 different tracks, including the quirky Tampa Bay.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a horse that we have no idea how good he is. He could be Justified. He's not putting up triple-digit buyers like Justified yet, but you can't hold that against him too much either, because has he been in a photo finish? He's dominated all 3 races, and each time against tougher competition. Yeah. That's the sign of a horse that could be a superstar. I mean, you don't know. It's like when I got in the elevator and Mike Mitchell's underestimating Zenyatta. Yeah. A lot of people, when the Derby's over, might be underestimating Kings Barnes. In fact, I saw a very interesting video about Kings Barnes. And Listen, a lot of very good points were made in that video, all kidding aside. And I mean, this horse, do you realize that horse, just in this alone, for the people that are just throwing him out, just like the garbage, like today's garbage, there's Kingsbarns, just throw him out the window. As a 2-year-old at the sale, he worked in 20 and change. 20 4/5 as a 2-year-old. And as a 3-year-old, he had the stamina with only 2 races under his belt to win a mile and 3/16 race, the distance of the Preakness. He's got that kind of speed and that kind of stamina. Hello? I mean, he definitely can win this race. There's not any question he could win it. Now, this might be, remember, he didn't run as a 2-year-old. We hardly hear anything about the Apollo jinx. One horse breaks it. Now it's like, but still, only 2 horses, Apollo in 1882 and Justify in 2018, have ever done this. So it's not like you say, well, it doesn't matter. Of course it matters.
Yeah.
It very well could be that this is biting off more than he can chew. No question. But I will tell you, the people that bought him and the people that have him, spendthrift, these people are very experienced in this game. And this is another thing as a bettor. You need to learn the trainers and the owners and the breeders to pick up signals of when. This is why when John Sadler, the way he talked about Flightline, after his maiden win, I knew he was possibly one of the best horses to ever run, at least in Southern California, because that guy does not talk about a horse like that. I mean, I've known him for, since 1981, and that guy just, I knew right away that this horse was way special. Not just maybe this could be anything. And that's the thing that these spendthrift people are talking about with Kingsbarns. They're going in very confident. Now, the thing about the Kentucky Derby will teach you in a hurry. Like point giving, you can go in very confident and then come out going, what the heck happened? Yeah. Or looking at Lucky or going back to Little Current. Little Current in a race that was a complete rodeo that was so bad that's what led to the capping of the race to 20. Was that how bad it was? It was, borderline dangerous. Yeah. And so they said, boy, 23 is too many. And so they capped it at 20. That race was such a mess that the guy that broke me in as a chart caller, you didn't have the video capabilities that you have today and everything. And so they only had a crew of a chart caller and a chart taker. And after that, they had two people doing it simultaneously. And the one guy would start try to call the first half, and the other 2 would deal with the back half to try to put the chart together. Because that 23 horse field overwhelmed everybody so much, and they missed all the trouble on Little Current. It says, something innocuous in the chart comments. And CBS showed the replay before the Preakness. And if you know trip handicapping at all, you're going like, that horse can't lose. And he won the Preakness by 7 and the Belknap by 7. I mean, he really should have been a Triple Crown winner, that horse. Little Current, no doubt about it. But I mean, the luck plays such a role in this Derby. The luck of the break, the luck of how often we get these wet tracks. There's so many variables here that come into play that so often you can have the best horse in the Kentucky Derby and not win it. So to me, starting with the best horse is where you really should start with who you think is the best horse and go from there. And a way to handicap and bet is, especially in horse racing, is try to picture in your mind how it will look if this horse wins. And if Kingsbarns wins, let's say he wins by 2 or 3 lengths. Believe me, all of a sudden the world's going to go, boy, we didn't realize it, but look what we got here. He's going to head to the Preakness and people are going to start talking Triple Crown for him because if Kingsbarns does win the Kentucky Derby, I think there's a pretty good chance he could win the Preakness because he's going to prove he is really something.
Yep.
And, I think he could head to the Belmont, where people start talking that he went at the 1.5 miles. But, another thing about Kingsbarns is that I think, whether he's on the lead or close to the lead, with the pace being what it figures to be, he's going to be in that prime first flight to me. That's why, to me, he's my I think he has the second best chance to win the Kentucky Derby.
Well, the problem I'm having with backing, if you want to back Tapit Trice, if you want to back Forte, the horses, they're going to have to run, we've so Tapit Trice and Forte, they've run down Mage, and they've had to run down Classic Car Wash and Verifying, who ran a great race. Don't get me wrong, but I'm not convinced that horse is going to be a 1.25 mile, type horse. So my point to that is they're going to have to be really good to run down. You just listed off the group, Kingsbarns and Derma and Practical Move. Because to your point, I think if you are a backer of Practical Move, which I know you are, if you're a backer of Kingsbarns, you're going to hit, and Halter and I have talked about this on Blinkers Off, you're going to hit the top of the stretch with thinking, I can win, he can win.
Yeah.
He is right there. Whereas if you're Tapit Trice, if you're Forte, especially, you're hoping, can he get there? Can he get there? Can he get there? And so, yes, I agree with you. I think Practical Move is one of the few horses of this field. He will be there. It's just a matter of, can he get the job done? Can Kingsbarns get the job done? But if you believe in those, they are going to sit the perfect. Both of those horses, I think, are going to sit the perfect trips in this race, which might be enough to win in a field that, like you said, is just kind of there's not a huge standout.
That's right. That was beautifully put, Jared. Beautifully put.
Well,
really, I mean that. Now, I said a good starting point is in trying to pick the winners, who you think is the best horse. And look, Tapit Trice, as I say, he could very well be the best horse. There's no question about that. But my approach here is there are many signs, not like one sign or two signs. There are many signs that tell me that Practical Move could, not is, but could be the best horse in this race. You start off with the fact that, again, in a crop that we've been lacking triple-digit buyers, he comes out and gets 100 in the San Felipe. And listen, I think that was a very valid number because I think Go Rocket Ride ran a heck of a race that day. I really do. Then I was not thinking he would duplicate. When he only won the Santa Anita Derby by $1, I fully expected this buyer to be in the 90s. Maybe the high 90s, but I wouldn't even been surprised to see maybe 95, 94. You know what? A regression like with Forte in the Florida Derby. That's kind of what I had in mind. When he didn't at the 8th hole, I thought Practical Move was going to win by, at least a couple lengths, 2.5 lengths, something like that. I really did. I think Vasquez did too, really, because he was kind of looking at his competition. I think he thought he had the horse under him. And I think he was surprised that Practical Move had to dig down so deep to win that race. But it's one thing to win the race like Forte did in the Florida Derby and get a 95, or run the race that Practical Move did and get 100, especially when it's back-to-back hundreds. That's really huge to me. And it's really huge to me when you look at Practical Move's past performances in the context of I think you can divide his form between sprints and routes. 1-turn races, 2-turn races. And if you look at his record in 2-turn races and forget the sprints, he suddenly is starting to look a lot better. And the thing is, I will give T.D. Thornton total credit here from the Thoroughbred Daily News. He's one of the guys I pay very much attention to, his top 12. Steve Haskin is another guy I have a lot of respect for out there. Those two guys very much. And it isn't just how they're ranking them or who they're ranking, it's what they say. And they bring a lot of interesting aspects to the table. And one of them with Practical Move is in the 16-point races for the Kentucky Derby, the preps that had the points, there were 16 in a mile and a 16th. Practical Move not only had the best time, he had the second best time. And this is kind of going hand in hand with the 100 buyer and the 100 buyer. And those weren't the two races because the Santa Anita Derby was a mile and an eighth race. It's the Los Alamitos Futurity and the San Felipe. And his time in the Los Alamitos Futurity was 143.06. And in the 141.65. So 141. And listen, how well you run in a mile and a 16th can really be a tip-off for the Kentucky Derby. And I'll tell you a horse that was the case. I'll have another. When he won the Robert Lewis at Santa Anita in 140 and change off a layoff, a long layoff, I was sitting next to Kurt Hoover. I said, there was nothing fluky about this race. That is such fast time for a mile and a 16th off a layoff by a new 3-year-old. And that's how that horse really got on my radar right then. And see, he was like 50 to 1 in that race, which was ridiculous. I made him like 15 or something on the morning line. But they all glommed on to a big favorite in that race, and he slipped through the cracks. But see, sometimes when these horses win at big odds, people think it's a fluke. But I said right there that day, I said, there's nothing fluky about this. Now, the pressure was on. They skipped the San Felipe. He had to get like 1-2 in the Santa Anita Derby to get into the Kentucky Derby. And he won it, but he didn't win it by a big margin. You know, he won it was kind of a hard drive that day. He ran better in the Kentucky Derby. And a lot of Santa Anita Derby beaten horses, by the way, even for Baffert, going back to Baffert's first Kentucky Derby that he barely lost. You think of all the Derbies that Baffert's won, his first one, he lost by a nose if it was a nose. Grindstone beat Cavalier by as close a margin as you could possibly. And I've talked to Baffert about that. And Baffert has said that he was so sick and disappointed after that race because he thought, I may never get back here again. But that's the reality. If you think about it at the time, that's how realistic he is. And he knows even then how hard it is to just get to the Kentucky Derby. And he's thinking, this might be my only chance I ever have to win. I'm going to lose by a nose. But see, Cavalier lost in the Santa Anita Derby. Real Quiet had lost in the Santa Anita Derby. Silver Charm had lost in the Santa. So again, for the Skinner people, that's something to keep in mind. There's a lot of Santa Anita Derby seconds, thirds, and fourths, including Giacomo, that then won the Kentucky Derby. So, you know, and so that's one reason I'm also not as hard on Practical Move for not winning the Santa Anita Derby by a bigger margin. But the main things he lost and got 100 buyer. Because again, if it's a 92 or a 94 or a 95, but now that he's got the back-to-back numbers, and the thing that T.D. Thornton pointed out, he had the 141.65 in the Los Alamitos Futurity, and in the San Felipe, he won it 143.06. So, I mean, 142.01. So 141 and change and 142.01. He was flirting with 141 and change again. And why is this important? This is important because, again, let's say hypothetically, Practical Move runs that fast, going a mile and a 16th in the mile and a quarter Kentucky Derby. That's going to put him in that position, Jared, that you were just talking about. That's why he is likely, you know, barring bad luck or something, but why he actually is likely to be in a very good position a mile and a 16th into the Kentucky Derby, especially with a pace that won't be all that fast. And then T.D. Thornton pointed this out. Of all the mile and an eighth Kentucky Derby points races, and there aren't as many as the mile and a 16th, but of all the mile and an eighth, he has the fastest of that too. So these are all signs. The back-to-back 100 buyers having the two best times. And listen, that the reason I was kind of quoting the wrong times here, the next fastest mile and a 16th winning time for these points races was Forte, and it was 1:43.06. Now, here's Practical Move, 141 and change, almost 141 and change. Everybody else, all of them that have run in any of those mile and a 16th Derby points races, they couldn't crack 143. And that's what you need to look for too. A little bit of a margin for error. It isn't just that he ran the fastest. He's running the fastest mile in the 16th races with, a gap.
Yeah.
And in this crop, that's not a minor deal here at all. So Forte, now the thing about Forte's 143.06, when was that? When he was a 2-year-old, when I think he was better than he is now as a 3-year-old. And that's kind of verified by the fact that in the Fountain of Youth, his time was 143.12. So it was actually, we're split in hundreds. But did he improve off that 143.06 in the Breeders' Cup? And again, we're talking different surfaces and things. So you have to take this all, with a grain of salt too, from that standpoint. It's not on the same day, at the same distance, same track. But these are indicators. That's all we use when we handicap as horse players. We're looking for signs and hints and trying to judge all this information we have. And there's plenty of information here for Practical Move to suggest he just might be the fastest horse of this bunch. Now, we talk about that, and I was saying how few horses have run a triple-digit buyer. We get back to Derma, Sotogake, and Randy Moss, who's the first guy that made me believe in speed figures when he and I were working at Louisiana Downs in 1980, and he was in publicity and I was working for the racing for him. He likes Derma Sotogake to win the race. I can't blame him. If you like him, I get it, because his UAE Derby was as impressive, if not the most impressive of the preps we've seen. I mean, it was lights out. And then you factor in how well the Japanese have been doing all over the country and all over the world. I mean, they win 2 Breeders' Cup races at Del Mar, including one that was a complete bomb. But listen, Japan, ever since they took Sunday Silence from us, that changed them radically, because he's in the pedigree of, the dam here is a descendant of both Derma Sotogake and Mandarin Hero. They got Sunday Silence in that pedigree. You're not almost going to find a top horse in Japan that doesn't have Sunday Silence in it. And the fact we didn't have Sunday Silence, is such a double whammy. Not only did they improve their breeding by having him, but our breeding was hurt by not having Sunday Silence, as great a sire as he turned out to be. That's, it's both sides of that fence. So, but Derma, while that race was fast, the UAE Derby, and he won with authority, Japan ran 1, 2, 3, 4 in that race, and they were strung out. And I have a little bit of a question of really who else was in that UAE Derby. In other words, could Tapit Trice had at least run second in there, or maybe win it? Practical Move. I mean, even Forte, if he's not as good as a 3-year-old as he was as a 2-year-old, I think maybe he could have at least run second in there at the very, in other words, so I'm saying that may look a little better than it is. Now, that's where the time of the race and the buyer that Randy Moss estimates that he would get comes into play. And I have to admit, guys, listen, we're human beings. And sometimes we can't help things, feeling a way about positive or negative. And listen, it's going to take a lot for me to embrace a UAE Derby winner again after I bet $1,000 to win on Thunder Snow and watched him turn into a bronking. He was 16-1 that day. If he wins that $16,000 and he comes out of the gate and it's like, you got to be kidding. Now, if he never goes on to do anything, you go, well, whatever. He goes on to win 2 Dubai World Cups. He made like $20 million, whatever. And it wasn't like that was the strongest Kentucky Derby to hit the pipe either. You know, that he couldn't have won that. So it's, you know, I've been burned with this UAE. That one was really bad, but I've been burned. I actually had in my fantasy stable Master of Hounds, who ran the best of any horse from the UAE Derby. How good was that? 5th.
Yeah.
That's the best they've done. Now, I think we all can agree the day's going to come. The clock is ticking. Japan, they're setting their mind to this. And when Japan is setting they want to win the Arc, which they should have done really already. They've been very unlucky and have come close. And the Kentucky Derby. That's 2 on their bucket list. And the way Japan has improved, and what they did that was so smart, they took Sunday Silence and got him, and then they would go each fall to that November breeding stock sale in Kentucky and snap up some of our best broodmares from bloodlines and race records. And look at what's happened. I mean, listen, guys, when I went to my first Japan Cup in the early 1900s, and it was Gary Stevens rode the winner. And it was Golden Pheasant trained by Charlie Whittingham. And at that time, Japan horses were nothing on the world stage. They couldn't even hardly win their own Japan Cup. And I'll tell you where one of the turning points was, big time, was a filly came over here for the American Oaks at Hollywood Park called Cesario. And fellas, if you had been there that day, you would never underestimate another Japanese horse as long as you live, because they came out on the track for that and she ran off. Nowadays, she would have been scratched for sure. She like worked a mile before running a mile and a quarter. I mean, it was like, you can throw her out. We were kind of chuckling in the press box. It was like, you think she's got a chance? She buried that field, just murdered him. It was one of the most breathtaking performances I've ever seen in my life. And when you add on to the fact that she like practically ran a race before the race, it's just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So, like I say, anybody that likes Derma Sotogake, including Randy Moss, I can't blame him. But I've been burned by that race. And, you know, this is a year that you figure could be right for this. Honestly, again, we're lacking horses with really strong buyer speed figures. And he is estimated to have gotten one. His buyer's figure was supposedly better than the winner of the Dubai World Cup, who is a son of Orfar, who the second time I was at the Japan Cup, he got beat a nose by Gentle Donna, who was a 2-time Japan Cup winner. And that Orfar he should have won an Arc. He ran in 2 Arcs. He should have probably won them both. But I mean, and he's another one that made like $8 billion before going to stud. But Derma Sotogake, you know, but it's the record is so poor. You know, 0 for 18 is 0 for 18.
Yeah.
You know, if a guy goes to the free throw line and misses 18 straight free throws, I am not betting on that guy to make the 19th try. I'm just not.
Fair.
And I tried to go against that with Thundersnow, and it made me be embarrassed. Not to mention lose $1,000.
It's funny now, but it wasn't at the time.
It's more funny now, but even so, it's still kind of, you know, like I said, this is one of those I'm going to have it proven to me.
Yeah.
You know, once somebody does it, I'll have a better feeling about the UAE Derby. And like I say, I think also if you can dig a little, this is the thing you have to do as a gambler. This is what's done every day by the dudes who bet daily. One of the best shows you'll ever see. That's led off with music that reminds me of when the ice cream truck was coming through our neighborhood. You'd hear that tinkling sound, and then you'd be heading out for your ice cream. And now I hear the tinkling sound, and I turn on Dudes Who Bet Daily.
Love it.
John comes running every time he hears
Yeah.
it.
He's like, here comes Samich. Papa Dude, here he comes.
Nobody's running to those guys.
Say, said no one ever.
Yeah. All right, so let's get to. Well, there's one horse that I keep seeing in the comments here that everybody wants an opinion on, and I think that he's to me, he's a very similar horse to Tapit Trice, and you can go into the the Pletcher versus Brad Cox because they've got a bunch in here. Angel of Empire. Angel of Empire is a horse that is seemingly getting better with each start. Now, the buyer numbers are not incredibly strong with the horse, but he's won 2 in a row. He's done it impressively. The Arkansas Derby, I thought, was ultra impressive. It visually was anyways. He's another horse, though, that's going to be in a similar position, maybe even worse so than Tapit Trice. He's going to have to make that big rounding. I know he's got a strike in your book, at least one. What are your thoughts on Angel of Empire?
Well, he does have one. Actually, he has none. He's in good shape strike-wise.
He does. I guess he is. I guess he gets himself in the position, doesn't he?
And that's the thing that's kind of makes him more attractive. Now, I have Tapit Trice third and him fourth, but to a certain extent, I like Angel of Empire better in terms of having a better chance to be first or second with 1/8 of a mile to go. Because he did that so early and made such a sustained run in that Arkansas Derby. And that was such a step forward for him. And he got on my radar back on New Year's Day when Victory Formation was everybody's, in love with at the time, understandably so.
Sorry,
Smarty Jones. And listen, Victory Formation ran really nice that day and was undefeated and looked like he could be a horse we'd be sitting here today talking about for the Kentucky Derby. This other horse was not practically anybody's radar at the time. And why he got onto my radar, it's what I said earlier about listening carefully to trainers, getting to know trainers, what they say, how they say it. As someone that covered racing since 1974 in either print journalism or broadcasting and interviewing all of these trainers and jockeys and breeders and owners for all these years, and handicappers too, you learn nuances of, like, for instance, going back to Charlie Whittingham. I would be standing next to Charlie in front of the grandstand and say it to Anita, I clocked a lot of horses with Charlie Whittingham and his assistant. And he, especially on the turf, he really wanted me there when they had turf workouts because the cones, they called the dogs, would be out and it gets tricky to time to the poles. And he always made me tell my time first. I'm like flawlessly one of the top female turf runners in the history of this country. I must have clocked her 30 or 40 times with Charlie, but every time he'd say, "What'd you get, White? What'd you get?" Because he trusted my clocking. The thing about Charlie, you'd be sitting with him and he might make a comment just a little offhanded. Some horse would be walking by and I'd say, "Who's that, Charlie?" And he'd say, "That's, the Gomper." And I'd say, "Oh yeah, who's he by?" And he'd say who he's by. And then he might say something like, he can run a little. That usually meant, like, if it was a first-time starter, again, I wouldn't bet him first time out because Charlie hardly ever won with a first-time starter. But I'm telling you, he was on my radar. And at some point, I was making a big bet on this horse because I knew he loved him. Now, a lot of trainers, like D. Wayne Lucas, if he just said he can run a little, that means, boy, he's probably not much.
Yep.
Bob Baffert's that way too. I mean, those guys, are going to tell you more optimistically. Mm-hmm. But when a guy like Charlie would just make a little comment like that meant the world. And so when Brad Cox, here he is, elated about this winner who looks so impressive in this and that, he was more interested in talking about the run. I mean, he really was. I could tell, he was more excited about Angel of Empire and how well he ran in defeat that day. And it wasn't like he got beat in a photo. He got drilled that day. So why would this trainer be so happy about that performance. And man, I'm telling you, I made a note right then and there. And one of the things he said was, this is a horse that we feel is going to get better as the races get longer. And so that's why I liked him next time out. And then that's why I liked him in the Arkansas Derby a lot. I liked him a lot there because I thought, boy, this is really, and so as good as he ran there. And the thing is, he wasn't making that late charge in a 1.125 race that gets a lot of people excited about the Kentucky Derby. That's why that 8th pole stat is so important. He'd already taken the lead by he made that such an early move and kept going. And another thing T.D. Thornton pointed out, he ran the second fastest final furlong of those 1.125 prep races. And that's especially impressive considering how early he started that run. So I have him ranked 4th. I mean, it's a photo for me between Tapit Trice and him 3rd and 4th. And the reason I even have those two come from behinders that high is I have that much respect for their upside. And the fact that Tapit Trice moved early enough in the Bluegrass and that Angel of Empire moved that early in the Arkansas Derby, unlike Forte in the Florida Derby. See, take those 3, and that's my big problem with Forte. He didn't make the early move, and he wasn't there at the 8th pole. And yes, so, practically everybody thought Forte was in big trouble. He was going to get beat. And yes, he won. And the fact he's only lost once, you have to respect him. But again, the fact of who he was running by, who had made such a big move, to me was clearly out of gas. And the time again indicates that. That time in that last part of that race was like glacier-like. So that's a bit of an optical illusion for me for Forte. And I can excuse the one, but the fact that he also kind of, didn't exactly set the world on fire in the Fountain of Youth either, makes me, not embracing Forte, and especially when he's the one that likely is going to be the favorite. So I'm high on Angel of Empire. Certainly anybody Cox sends out anywhere these days, you've got to give just the greatest respect. I mean, he helped me win my fantasy league a couple of years ago because I claimed a horse called Nick's Go. And he ended up having quite a good year. He ended up being horse of the year and helped me win my fantasy league. And one of the reasons I claimed him is it looked to me like that horse had improved by leaps and bounds when he got in Cox's hands. It was like you flipped a switch and that horse was a whole different horse. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. This year I was kind of hoping for that to be the case with Charge It. And I claimed Charge It. Charge It was drafted in our league and got dropped. And I thought, here's a horse that, off that big win last year in the Dwyer. And I mean, I'm so disappointed in Charge It. Not that he didn't win the Oaklawn handicap, but gee, Christmas, he can't run any better than that.
I'm so over that horse.
I'm so glad you said that because I've been so mad at Charge It, and I feel like I've had nobody to tell it to until now. I hate that.
We need to form a Charge It group, therapy group, a Charge It therapy group.
Yes.
I don't even want to talk about him. I don't even want to go to therapy about him. I just want to forget about him.
I'm with John. All right. They turned for home and I'm like, okay, he's not going to fire like a great race, but I still expected him to try. And when he took that left-hand turn and ran right up to the ass of whoever he was, Stiletto Boy, I think, I thought, you're dead to me, Charge It. You just did that. I'm done with you.
Yeah, but that's what happens with us. I mean, we have it in the dudes Triple Crown League and, anything, the football fantasy leagues or anything. And just as bettors, I mean, we get the thrills and the disappointments and, in Charge It's been a disappointment, but I hit a home run with Nick's Go. So, I mean, you get the good with the bad, but, you get such high hopes, like for instance, Jared and I at least we're both on the same boat here. Unfortunately for Jared, it won't help for the Triple Crown, but Extra Anejo. And he's the type of horse that could really, he could be what I need now with the disappointment from Charge It, because Extra Anejo is cranking up. And listen, guys, I'm not convinced that this horse isn't, if he's not in the same league as Flightline, at least close. I think he has that kind of potential. I really do. Now, I mean, I could be way off base. I could be proven wrong. It may be the fact that he needed the surgery and he won't come back as good as that debut win. But I'm telling you, off that debut win, to me, that horse could be, I mean, we talk about who might be the best 3-year-old in the country. I start with him for me. And Arabian Night would be another one. But see, the thing I like about Extra Anejo better than Arabian Night, the thing that bothers me about that Arabian Night is that motion of his again.
Mhm.
That paddling, you know, he's fast and he's good, but that just, you know, that to me, and it's to me not shocking that Arabian Night's having trouble putting together a campaign.
Yeah.
And Extra Anejo has a nice way of going, but he just ended up, you know, having to need surgery. But as far as talent, at this point, if we started right now and said you can take any one of these horses to own, I would take Extra Anejo right now, because he's not behind the Flightline schedule really.
No.
You know, he ran it too. He's got plenty of time to put together a career that could be Flightline-ish. And that, I know I'm setting the bar very high there. That's what I personally think of him. I really do. And listen, I know I'm not alone at being high on him, because I know Jared is too.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, you and I are, you know, we're the two founders, I think, of the fan club. We're constantly, anytime he has a work, we basically race each other to see who's the first one to say it. You know, we're watching him like a hawk. Yeah, and the way he's working, it seems like we're going to see him on the Derby undercard, which is unfortunate. I think you and I both would have preferred if he was in the Derby. But yeah, undercard, whether it be the Pat Day, it would likely be an allowance race. But yeah, you know, we saw what Life is Good did off of the injury. You know, I took him he came back. He came back as good as, you know, as he was, if not better. So I'm not necessarily worried about the injury.
That's a good horse to bring up here, because I think at the very least he's that good.
Oh, yeah.
I think he could be better than Life is Good. I honestly think he could be. Listen, in my Express Bet blog, predicted a Triple Crown for the horse. And I don't do that like all the time, to say the least. I predicted it I said Riva Ridge might win the Triple Crown. I wrote that in my high school paper in 1972. And I wasn't far off. He won 2/3 of it. And in 1973, I said Secretariat will, not might. Riva Ridge, I said might. Secretariat, I said will. And he did. And I also predicted one for American Pharoah. That was in the Louisville Courier-Journal. I didn't predict he'd win the Derby. I predicted he'd win the Triple Crown. And that was with a 37-year drought. So I correctly predicted Secretariat off a 25-year Triple Crown drought. And I predicted one with American Pharoah off a 37-year drought. That's a 25-year drought, 37-year drought. And I felt comfortable enough to predict one off of that debut win by Extra Anejo. I thought, and listen, the way the speed figures are and everything for this crop, if he had not gotten hurt, I'm not saying I think he very well might have been a horse capable of doing this. I really do. I think he could definitely be, and I'm saying could again, but he could put together an Arrowgate type second half of the year and, you know, be monstrous in like the Travers and what have you, the Haskell and whatever the second half of the year. Believe me, I think he's one, you know, we're not seeing anything. What we were just talking about, Charge It in the older ranks. Are we seeing any? There's no Flightline this year, guys.
Mm-mm.
There's nothing even close.
Wide open. It's wide open.
Yeah. So to me, if Extra Anejo is what I think he might be, I mean, in other words, if I could get a big number, they don't have the Eddie Breeders' Cup future book right now. He'd probably be a decent number off just the maiden win.
Yeah.
And I tell you right now, I would be betting him at like, what, at 20, 30, 40 to 1 or something. I would be involved in that.
Yeah.
So, you know, and speaking of the future books, of course, I have to try to be as objective as I can about Practical Move, because on February 12th, I put 200 on him at 83 to 1. So if he wins, it's almost $17,000. And Kings Barnes, you know, I'm also a little biased there because that same day I bet 200 on him at 35 to 1. So that's 7,000. So if either I've got him ranked 1, 2, and probably part of that is because you know, I can't help it. I'm human. But
Yeah.
honestly, if Forte, let's say hypothetically, Forte had the right buyer pattern, he'd not been having trouble being 1, 2 at the 8th hole, if he looked like, you know, he was the horse, I'd have him at the top. But, you know, I think there's plenty of questions there. And as I say, I think you can make a compelling case. The Practical Move has at least as good a chance as anybody to win this. There isn't anybody that you know, but he's one of many. I mean, you can go so deep in this race that this year that, you know, as I say, it's partly what makes this year's Kentucky Derby so interesting. But, you know, you're not often involved. I'm sensing Practical Move is not even, he might be a decent price on Derby Day because, you know, there are not many people talking about him or seem to like him, you know, which doesn't bother me. I mean, I liked I'll Have Another. Nobody really liked him much, and he drew the 19 hole. And that, of course, is something, you know, that you mentioned it, Aaron, you know, next week we'll know the Derby draw and everything. And there's no more important post position draw than the Kentucky Derby. That said, when I'll Have Another, who I had bet in the future book, I sat right next to Randy Moss on the day of the Santa Anita handicap. And they worked I'll Have Another between races. And he worked so good that day that was the weekend that they had one of those Kentucky Derby future pools. And I went right over and bet him in that thing. And he was a pretty good price. And I don't remember offhand, but he was a good price in that because all he had won was the Lewis as a huge long shot. And but that workout told me right then and there that what I had seen in that Lewis, it was verified by that work. It was that fast. And it was the first work I'd ever clocked on my phone. And Randy Moss clocked it on his phone too. We came within like a couple of hundreds of each other's time, and we were right on his time. And workouts can be important, guys. I mean, they can be overblown too, but they can be important. When Bracco had his final workout before the 1993 Breeders' Cup Juvenile, the San Gabriel Mountains behind Santa Anita were on fire. And Bobby Frankel took a filly and put her on a van to send her to Hollywood Park because we were having Santa Ana winds and trees were blowing off, leaves and branches and everything all over the place. And Frankel was so smart, one of the smartest trainers I've ever been around. I could spend an hour just talking about him and what I learned from him and so forth, being around him. But he took a mare and put her on the van to send her to Hollywood Park to get her away from the smoke and the wind and the fires. And she got hurt on the van. So he was doing the right thing, and it came back to bite him because in a fluke, she got hurt on the van. But Bracco had his final work before the Breeders' Cup. Gary Stevens was on him. He hadn't run in a stakes race yet, Bracco. He'd won a maiden race and an allowance race. And Gordon Jones threw him out in the Breeders' Cup because he hadn't raced around 2 turns. This is where you have to be careful as a handicapper, thinking you know what's going on, and you don't know the whole story. And I ended up working as a steward with Bracco's trainer, Randy Winnick. And Randy was telling me, and I knew it at the time too, but he verified this. They were trying to get a 2-turn race, allowance race for Bracco, and it wouldn't fill. And so he had to run him in a sprint. And he won the sprint big, but he told Gary Stevens, work him out an additional like quarter mile, but at least a furlong. I mean, we're going back to 1993. So, but the whole point was that he was going to compensate by not running in a 2-turn race by having the horse not just gallop out, but work on out. And as a steward, according to the rules, if a trainer does that, you are to actually let the stewards know that you're doing that. So, and they did. So but Gordon Jones was throwing the horse out in the Breeders' Cup because he hadn't raced 2 turns. Well, that was true, but the trainer had done the next best thing. And seeing this workout by Brocco, I clocked it myself, standing by myself in the wind with the mountains on fire. And I thought, holy cow. At that time, the big horse from back east that was undefeated, his name escapes me at the moment. He ended up being the champion that year. But I knew this horse Brocco was going to beat that horse for sure. Tahir.
Yeah.
Tahir was the big horse from the east. It was going to be the big favorite in the Breeders' Cup. But I knew Tahir wouldn't know which way Brocco went. And the icing on the cake was I went to the Santa Anita walking ring there where the Seabiscuit statue is. And Randy Winnick brought Brocco back through there and had him school a little bit there in the walking ring before taking him back to the barn. And the look on Gary Stevens' face, he didn't have to tell me anything. He didn't have to say anything. Knowing Gary as well as I did, just as he talked to Randy Winnick and the look on Gary Stevens' face, I knew that Brocco was a cinch. And he won for fun that day. I'm thrilled to hear. And by the way, on the way back to the barn, we were concerned, Randy Winnick especially, concerned about all these flying branches and the debris and everything. And right by the guard shack at the parking lot there for the stable people and employees, a big branch fell right by Brocco. Brocco reared up. He could have hurt himself there. And this was his final workout before the Breeders' Cup. So fortunately, he came through it without getting hit by tree debris or something, or choking on the smoke because it was so smoky. And so he got the job done. But that's where those types of things, again, like I say, you don't know what's going on behind the scenes.
So so I've had a couple of different comments here. You being a morning line guy, and that's a huge. I think I feel like this year more than anything, it's like everyone's been trying to guess who's going to be. Yeah, obviously we know Forte. I mean, whether it's whatever he's 3-1 or 7-2, 5-2, whatever. But I think everyone's really like, where's Practical Move going to be? Is Derma going to be the second choice? Like, how would you kind of guess, or if you were making the morning line for this, like, where are you kind of? Who do you think is going to take all this money? If say the top 5, like what are you expecting to get on some of these horses?
Great question. And I will tell you this year is trickier than most years because of what happened last year. And there's a pretty good chance that is going to affect the betting in this year's Kentucky Derby.
Yep.
I came up with kind of an early line for Steve Bick, and I had a number of 50-1 shots. But I'm going to tell you, I'm not sure that we're going to see that this year, because when Giacomo won and then Mind Your Bird won, there was a fallout from that. And remember the kind of people that are betting into the Kentucky Derby pool. So you have to know the circumstances of what kind of money's being bet. And of course, there's a lot of serious money being bet. There's also a lot of not serious money being bet. That's how you can get like a horse called My Boy Jack. That seemingly every Jack in the world puts some money on. And I actually kind of like the horse, but you talk about a wise guy horse that isn't the price he should be in any way, shape, or form. And with Rich Strike winning last year, there's going to be people putting money on more than ever on these horses that you wouldn't think would get much money at all, because there were fewer 50-1 and up shots coming out of Mind That Bird for years. There was a real domino effect of that. Mm-hmm. So unless that changes, and I don't really overly expect that to change, because it also happened after Giacomo, but it really happened after Mind Your Bird, that when he pulled that 50-1, it was like, you just didn't see the 80-1 shots and 70-1 shots and 120-1 shots that you were typically seeing with a 20-horse field.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was young, for instance, when we're going back to that 1974 Kentucky Derby that I say Little Current should have won, he was in the mutual field. See, back then you had 12 betting interests, not even 14. You had 12 betting interests, and everybody else in the gate was coupled as a field. And so the people that liked Little Current got robbed. He was an individual entry at the New York OTB, and he paid like $50 or whatever it was at the time. It was something big. But because you were getting like 6 or 7 or 8 horses or something, or 9 or whatever, it paid like 4-1 or 6-1, or it was something you would have never gotten. I mean, you feel sorry for the people that actually liked Little Current. So these are aspects to trying to guess what these odds are going to be. So right off the bat, that being, if I'm right, and the longer shots aren't as long this year as they would have been without Rich Strike, that means the prices are going to be a little better for everybody else. There aren't the longer shots. So that's why a horse like Practical Move, to me, if he'd won the Santa Anita Derby by 2 or 3, I think he would clearly be the second favorite in this race. At least even with Tapit Trice as co-second favorite. But if he'd won by 2 or 3, I think he would have been, considering the success of the Santa Anita Derby, I think, and if it had been Bob Baffert training the horse, I think he could have vied for favoritism off a Santa Anita Derby win, because Baffert draws that much more money. So with Forte being Pletcher, I think he'll be the favorite again, like we say. But I think Tapit Trice might give Forte a run for favoritism. That wouldn't shock me. Derma Sotogake is the huge wild card. Who knows? Now, when I gave my line to Bick like 3 weeks ago, I had him at 8. And before that, I kind of was thinking 12. Well, the last I looked in Vegas, which was Monday, he was like 12-1, 12-1 in Vegas. That's important, what these horses are being bet in Vegas. That means more than, for instance, like the Derby Watch line in Daily Racing Form. Now, David Aragona, who makes the morning line in New York, he's the one doing that this year for the first time for the Racing Form. He's an outstanding line maker. He is. There's no doubt about it. And he had Derma Sotogake in single digits. But Vegas had him, like I say, at 12-1. Nobody's betting into Aragona's line. That's just his opinion. People are betting into those lines in Vegas. So in other words, if they put up a bad number in Vegas, that's going to get corrected. In other words, if 12-1's too high, they're going to get so much money, they're going to lower it, especially, a horse that is going to go lower, because Vegas doesn't typically like to be involved in gambling. It's hard to say, but it's true. I mean, they want every edge and everything. I mean, that's why when I got $100 on Justified, 100-1, I got it after, before his first start. And I had a friend in Vegas, and he came in right after Nick Casado had bet Justify at 300-1. And so they knocked it from 300 to 100. And actually, my friend got Justify at 150. And then they knocked it off of him. And my friend says, well, I want to bet for my friend. And they said, well, now it's 100. But that was still plenty. But, when I made that bet, $200, honestly, guys, I thought I was throwing $200 right out the window. Why? Because no horse he'd had no races, so he might not even get to the Kentucky Derby. I mean, how's he going to get the points right there? And I mean, he hadn't run as a 2-year-old, as we know. He's the one that did it, the first one since 1882. But I mean, there was so much going against him. But I knew how much Baffert liked it, and what the reason that pushed me onto his betting him was Friday morning he was entered to run on Sunday at Santa Anita. And I was listening to the Steve Vick show, and Rick Hammerly, the racing secretary at Santa Anita, came on to this day as a regular guest on that Sirius XM show. And this is what I say, paying attention to what people say, what they say, how they say it. And he said, boy, something just was kind of funny happened to me in my racing office, he said to Vic. And Vic says, what's that? And he says, Bob Baffert was just in my office. And he said, he's never in my office. Now, see, that's something I didn't know. I didn't know if Baffert was in there all the time or not all the time. So that was kind of interesting to me, that the guy that had been so successful on the Southern California circuit was hardly ever in the racing office. He said, this maiden race, it's very important that it goes. Because Baffert knows if this horse doesn't, if this race gets called off because it doesn't have enough horses, he's going to be too late to make the Derby. And so it went with 5. And see, one fewer horse, that wouldn't have gone. That's how close Justify came to not even running in the Kentucky Derby. If that race right there does not fill, and it was within 1 horse of not filling. But then when Rick Hammerly said, anybody out there in your fantasy leagues and everything, you might want to think about picking this horse up. Well, unfortunately for me, I was already out of claims for my month. You get 2 claims per month. I was out. But I thought, I can't claim this horse, but I have a friend in Vegas, so I'll take a swing and bet on the horse with this kind of buzz. And that's how I got the 100 to 1 odds on him, because he hadn't even run yet. And even when he won his first race, I thought, what are the odds that he's even going to make it to the Kentucky Derby? And Baffert threw out a red herring saying I might send him to Sunderland because he knew the next step, he wanted an allowance race to go. Yeah. And that was going to be dicey. And that one almost didn't go. It got 5. So that's another one that if that doesn't go and it gets 4 horses, he's not in the, because then he wouldn't have been in the Santa Anita Derby. So that's how close. When I cashed the bet for $10,000, and John Avello at the Wynn, where the bet was made, he said, "Yeah, some guy came in and really got us at 300 to 1." I said, "Yeah, I know. That's Nick Casado. That's Slam Dunk Racing. He heads up the Slam Dunk Racing ownership." He said another guy came in, and I said, "Yeah," and I said that was my friend, and then he says. I said, so then I got in there, and he says, well, that's kind of tough, that we got hit that hard like that. And I said, yeah, but he says, one reason I wasn't lowering the odds faster on that horse is no horse had won the Kentucky Derby without running as a 2-year-old since 1882. He said that to me the next, when I went over to cash the ticket. So he was aware. The odds were all in his favor, not my favor. You think about the 100 to 1, you say that was great. But honestly, in the reality of that horse to win that race, let alone the Triple Crown, I wasn't betting him to win the Triple Crown, just 1 race. But, to have to run on a wet track and go to Churchill. And remember, American Pharoah ran one of the worst races of his life when he won the Kentucky Derby. That's the race that most horses would have been beat by Firing Line and Gary Stevens. And then he wins the Preakness of Belmont, and you say, he should have been a Triple Crown winner. But American Pharoah was good enough, and against that field, and good enough as a horse to run not his best race and win the Kentucky Derby. And that's kind of what it takes. So, I mean, again, everything has to go so much right for you. And that was the case with Justify. I mean, he had to have that kind of talent. But again, he had to have so many things go right for him on top of that. That's why it's almost amazing any time we can pick the winner of the Kentucky Derby, to be honest. I mean, it's like, you sit there and go, wow, that was, and that's one reason why when you do it, even when it's a horse that you're expecting to win, like an American Pharoah. See, I felt that the key to that Derby was who was better, American Pharoah or Dortmund. Because remember, Dortmund was undefeated going into the Kentucky Derby and won the Santa Anita Derby. He wasn't chopped liver. And, you know, I was very confident that American Pharoah was better than Dortmund. That was the key to that Derby. That was the key to that Triple Crown. And that's, you know, the key with me on Secretariat. I felt he was better than Sham, even though Sham beat him in the Wood Memorial. But I knew that was not, whatever the reason, the pace or an abscess or whatever. And as bettors, you have to be able to throw out a bad game, a bad race, you know, and just, you don't even have to know why. Now, you can't keep making excuses. That's why I'm upset with charging. You know, you can only keep making excuses for so long. And then you say, I have overrated this horse. It'd be like if Extra Nail comes out, he gets beat first time out and then got beat again. I'd say, I was wrong about it. I mean, he's obviously not the horse I thought he was. So, I mean, you have to go with the flow and as it is at the time. But, you know, and by the way, another thing I like about Practical Move, I wanted to mention that breeding, because so much is being made that he's by Practical Joke. That, you know, he's out of an Afleet Alex mare. And it's not only important because Afleet Alex won the Preakness almost falling down and won it by daylight and won the Belmont by a big margin going 1.5 miles. But you have Hawkster in that family. And I called the Daily Racing Form chart of Hawkster's Oak Tree Invitational in 1989. And this was, I talked about that freakish performance by Cesario. This was a freakish performance because Hawkster, Pat Valenzuela was named to ride and didn't show up that day. And Ron McAnally, most famous as the trainer of John Henry, had to find a rider at the last minute, and he gave the mount to Russell Bays, who was riding regularly in Southern California at the time, and of course would end up being the winningest jockey in North American history, who I happened to see win his very first race at Yakima Meadows in the 1970s. He rode a horse for his father. And by the way, in that race, Gary Bays' father, Russell Bays' father, Joe Bays, was as good a jockey as I've ever seen. As good as Eddie De La Houssaye, or, I mean, just maybe not quite as good as Shoemaker and Pinkai, but Joe Bays was a phenomenal jockey. That he got hurt, lost a kidney back when there wasn't a kidney transplant. So they told him you have to retire because if you lose another kidney, you know, you'll basically die because there were no kidney transplants. And so then they got kidney transplants. He made a comeback. I only saw the guy ride in the last like 4 or 5 years of his career, at the twilight of his career, and he was sensational. I mean, that guy, if you guys saw Defunded the other day and what happened there with Hernandez, and, you know, coming out of the gate, I thought Defunded was dead. But Hernandez rode such a smart race because he didn't send him. He sat on him. And that Joe Bays did that. You'd bet a horse that was a stone cold front runner and would stumble bad or rear at the start, have a horrible start, be 5-6 behind the field. You think you were dead? He'd come from behind and win. Russell Bays' father, the only other 2 jockeys I ever saw do this as much as him, Pat Day and Eddie De La Houssaye. They'd be on a front runner and 2 or 3 horses would go by. And you'd go, well, so much for that. And they'd come back and win by 2 or 3. That was Russell Bays' father. So Russell Bays picks up the mount on this Hawkster. They're going 1.5 miles. And he comes by the stand. You can go to YouTube and watch this. It's on YouTube. Just put in Hawkster Oak Tree Invitational. He comes by the stands the first time. He's like 5-6 in front, go into the back stretch. They're heading to the far turn. He's 7 in front. He's like running off. You're like, there's no way he's going 1.5 miles. And he ended up winning by like 4 lengths and broke the world record.
Wow.
But that horse, that's one reason I was confident Afleet Alex could go 1.5 miles. Because this horse in his pedigree ran one of the best 1.5 mile races I ever saw in my life. This is all on the bottom side of Practical Move's pedigree. And the thing is, so many people focus on the sire. Remember I said, people said that Secretariat can't win the Kentucky Derby because he's by Bold Ruler. And he was out of a Prince Quillo mare. And Prince Quillo was one of the greatest sources of stamina in American racing and breeding ever. How good was Prince Quillo as a broodmare sire? He was not only the broodmare sire of Secretariat, he was the broodmare sire of Sham. So as a broodmare sire, that's his exacta in the Kentucky Derby. That's his exacta in the Preakness. But people, it was bold ruler, bold ruler, bold ruler. Nothing about Prince Quillo. And see, it's practical joke. Nothing about a Fleet Alex. Very little. And believe me, that in and of itself. And I got on the subject of workouts with Brocco. The last workout by Practical Move ranks right up there with one of the workouts that has increased my confidence going into a race, like Brocco. One of the best I've ever seen. I was very worried about Practical Move's tank getting emptied as hard as he had to run to hold off Mandarin Hero and Skinner. I mean, he ran his tail off there. And I did like the way he galloped out. It wasn't like they opened up on him on the gallop out. No. His gallop out was good too. And his gallop out in the San Felipe was really good. So, and these are important clues again about him being asked to go a mile and a quarter. But this workout that he did with Kangaroo Court is one of the better sprinters we really have here in Southern California right now. Certainly one of the best Calbred sprinters, but he's, to me, one of the best sprinters. He's really good. And here is Practical Move working in tandem. They're coming down the stretch. You can go to XBTV and see this. And that rider in Practical Move's standing up. And he's working right with Kangaroo Court. They come down there. Now here again, if the workout time's 49 and change or 50 flat or something, it's not that big. It was 47 flat.
Yep.
He's almost working 46 and change. I'm not saying you watch the hands on the exercise rider, they weren't moving, but the rider's standing up, tall in the irons. That workout, because it told me that there's lots in that tank left out of that San Anita Derby. See, he'll work again Friday. And I don't anticipate, because this was such a good work, they'll just be looking for a maintenance. Tim Yaktin's not going to want to see him do something too fast. They don't, because they want to try to keep that tank. Especially, they know the situation. They know they're going to have to go a mile and a quarter. The owners are familiar with this situation because a lot of their successes come in quarter horse racing. So already to go a mile and an eighth, they're going farther than they're used to going. And so, this is a deal to where I'm already kind of anticipating, but really good horses will do what Practical Move just did on his own. They don't have to ask him to work fast. He just worked fast. And remember what I said about the back-to-back buyers, the two best times in the mile and the 16th preps, the best time in the mile and an eighth. You start putting all of it with this workout, all of this together. And listen, this isn't his first really good workout. One of the reasons I bet $200 on him in the future book that day, February 12th, Brad Free had written about a workout of his and was quoting Tim Yaktin. And this horse had a phenomenal final quarter in this work and galloped out like a monster. And he hadn't run this year yet. That's why I got 83-1. This was before the San Felipe.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sitting there going, listen, that workout alone is telling me this could be one of the better 3-year-olds we got around here, let alone in the country. And then, of course, he went out and won the San Felipe like he did. But see, it isn't like he's just done one thing to make you think he's a really good horse, or done one thing to make you think he can win the Kentucky Derby. He's done multiple things here. So, and I'll say this about his rider. I like his rider. I liked Mario Gutierrez on I'll Have Another. And Steve Beck has made the point a lot of times. Beck ran into Mario Gutierrez at the Kentucky Derby in the elevator, and he said, man, that guy looked like the deer in the headlights. And he says, so I couldn't believe from post 19, remember, no other horses ever won the Kentucky Derby from post 19. And Beck's going, I couldn't believe he rode such a good race. And I'm sitting there going, first of all, this guy early in his career was riding at Hastings Racecourse in Vancouver, BC, where I used to go all the time, which is a 5/8 bull ring with riders that are nowhere the caliber of the jockeys he's riding against on a mile track with a long stretch in the Kentucky Derby. And this guy cut his teeth to where you really have to have riding ability to stay out of trouble and be a successful rider like he was. That's why a lot of times if you see a good turf rider, they're going to be an outstanding rider on a bull ring track like Los Alamitos used to be, or any of these tracks that are not a mile. But the fact that Beck told me, I said, the fact he was deer in the headlights in the elevator is one thing. That's not, if he was going to compete in the elevator, I would have been concerned. He was competing out on the track. And I guarantee you two things. First of all, because he hadn't been in the Kentucky Derby, he didn't know whether to get all that excited about it. It wasn't that big of a deal. It was the next time he wanted it, because I've interviewed too many jockeys, and they've told me the first time I did it, I didn't really fully appreciate what a big deal it is. See, the next time they know it's a big deal, that's where they can get nervous, make a mistake. That first time they're going in cold turkey, it's just kind of another race to them. To a certain extent, they know it's a big deal. It's the Kentucky Derby and so forth, but not as much as the second time. The other thing about riding out there, I've told Beck myself, once he got on the horse and went out to the track, that's his comfort zone. Being amongst all the people, that's not his comfort zone. Mm-hmm. Being out there where he's grown up and spent his career riding horses, I'm comfortable. It's like when I play basketball, maybe walking into the gym or in the dressing room, whatever, I might, have some nerves. Once I got out on that court, that's what I've been doing for years, every day. I'm fine with this. This is what I do. So, this is the thing about Vasquez. That guy won such an important race for me a couple of years ago on the Breeders' Cup undercard in the 1.5 mile race. He was riding that horse that was winning all those marathons.
Lone Rock.
Thank you. See, someday you'll be asking somebody else younger to sit there.
Sorry.
No, but I mean, listen, when I was Secretariat, I was sitting there writing in my high school paper in 73, and it seemed like all the people that had seen Secretariat were all these old fuddy-duddies. That had been a 25-year drought. Now I lived through a 37-year drought and everything. I mean, we're talking 50 years since Secretariat. So it'd been 25 years since Citation when I was young. Now it's 50 years since Secretariat. Twice as much as that was for Citation when I was in high school. So, but Lone Rock, was running against Tis a Magician. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't that familiar with that because I know he'd done well at Oakland and everything. Yep. But look, this was a very important race to me. I was not having I had a bad Friday, and this was all not going bad fast. And I stepped up and bet that horse big. And that he couldn't have ridden him. I mean, so that I will forever be thankful to Ramon Vasquez for that. But I've had a chance now to watch him at Del Mar, Santa Anita, regular basis. That guy, I have no problem with him. I know he can run. Look at these rides he's put on Practical Moves, saving that ground and everything. Mm-hmm. He may find that not to be the place to be if he gets behind some horse stopping in his face in the Kentucky Derby. But like I say, I feel fine with Vasquez. Would I be happier with, a guy that's won the Derby a bunch of times, whatever? Of course. look at Kent DeSormo and his record in the Kentucky Derby, or Velasquez, or the guy Mike Smith, But this guy I have no problem with at all. I feel that I should get a good ride from him. I'm expecting one, and if he has bad luck, and it's not his fault, but he can't control the luck, but he can control his decisions. And from what I've seen from that guy, he's very good at his decision making during a race. If he has to call an audible or go inside, outside, whatever. Look at that ride last year by Sonny Leone. That is one of the greatest rides you'll ever see in the Kentucky Derby ever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's phenomenal. I mean, that's another thing about, and how can you not feel sorry for, all right, tell me who ran second.
Epicenter.
I mean, you run that Derby 100 times.
Yeah.
Yep.
And Epicenter wins it like 95, and Rich Strike once, and maybe 4 others or something. That's the way I see it. Because Epicenter will beat Zandon every time.
Yes.
And the rest of them. So I would go so far to maybe make it 99-1.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel so bad for the connections of Epicenter on that, because that's what the Derby can do to you, right? Mm-hmm. And that guy was like Mike Smith on Giacomo. That guy, what he made, and even coming down the stretch where he could have just got stopped cold turkey, and he just finds the way to get. It was incredible. I mean, when you see the blimp shot of that, you just shake your head and go, man, oh man, if you didn't know that horse and that guy's name, you would swear that's like Eddie Arcaro or William Partak or Bill Shoemaker or somebody, not Sonny Leone. I mean, it's one for it really is. I mean, but see, again, I think part of it was that guy didn't know to even be nervous or anything. He's on a 50-1 shot. And like I kind of wrote in my expressbet.com blog, I'm surprised they almost let him into the jockey's room. Like they're going like, who are you? So he's lucky they even let him be in the race, sort of. I mean,
well, shit, he wasn't even in the race 2 days before that. So that's the thing.
That's right.
Well, okay, so there we go, guys. Practical Move is the pick, right? It's your pick.
Yeah, and obviously I hope he draws well. But as in the case with I'll have another. I was swearing on the HRTV set. Fortunately, we weren't on the air. I was sitting next to Millie Ball. I mean, I'm going like, you got to be kidding me. Post 19, really? And then by the time I drove home, which is only a mile away, I told my wife, because she goes, oh, I'm sorry he drew 19. And I said, well, I was mad at first, but I said, something? If he's the horse I think he is, that's not why he's going to get beat. It's going to be because he's not the horse I think he is. That post will not. See, I had enough confidence in Gutierrez, and I thought, he'll stay out of trouble being wide, and I think he's the best horse. And either he is or he's not. That it's not post 19, Big Brown 1 from 20. So, like I say, at the time of point given, if you drew anything past 12, people thought you might as well forget it. That shows you how things can change. We don't know the effect of this new gate on, let's say Practical Move draws the rail. It might not be as bad as it was. It did. Mo Donegal, I don't think it really was a huge plus for him, but we just don't have enough evidence. But it's a different circumstance with that gate, so we don't know. I mean, so I think Practical Move, as I say, I see enough evidence to feel going into the Kentucky Derby, he's the best horse. He's the fastest horse. He's got the class. He's got the tactical way of running. And he's also got heart. And while I was disappointed that he didn't win the Santa Anita Derby by a larger margin than a nose, I wouldn't have given you a nickel for him to win that race at the 16 pole. I wouldn't have given you another nickel. He'd run second. And he won. Yeah. That's not something to take lightly either. because he could end up in that last furlong. He might get in a fight. And I will say it shows a lot to me that he dug down deep in there and found a way to win, especially when it's a 100 buyer. If he's digging deep for a 92 buyer and a slow final time, you know, and I know his thoroughgraph wasn't all that great. But see, here's another thing that you've got to take into consideration. When we look at these figures, they're made in different ways. I've talked a lot about how the buyers don't take into account how easily a horse wins. And I think you should give the horse a plus. I also talk about they don't take into consideration your ground loss or the wind or the weight, the things that thoroughgraph Ragozin will do. That's why those numbers are better. But a horse will get overlooked sometimes by the thoroughgraph and Ragozin people. See, something you have to keep in mind about Practical Move, he's been athletic enough and good enough and has the tactical speed enough to put himself in a position to have these ground-saving trips in the Los Alamitos Derby, the San Felipe, and the Santa Anita Derby. You know, he's made those trips. He's good enough to get those trips.
Yeah.
Does that mean he won't get as good a thoroughgraph because he's not 4 and 5 wide? It's why Skinner gets a better thoroughgraph number. And it's partly why Skinner to me is dangerous in this race. Besides the fact he's got a trainer that can get a horse to peak for the big race. And listen, Skinner's had a couple of workouts here lately that, because John Sheriff's is another guy. He doesn't work horses. This is out of his norm. And by the way, a long shot in this race, I think to hit the boards disarm. I really do. I definitely think he might hit the board at a big price here. And people are down on him because of the Lexington. Steve Asmussen has made it very clear. He was not wound up. He was not fully cranked. They didn't want to. They knew if they got the points that if they had to ask him too much, it would be almost pointless to run in the Kentucky Derby then anyway. So their purpose was to run at least third without asking him as little as possible. And this workout, again, what I tell you guys about workouts, you can overblow them, you can misread them. The way I looked at this workout by Disarm, this is so un-Asmussen-like, and it makes sense what he's doing here. See, I'll tell you another Asmussen workout that made me make a huge bet on a horse. It's called Matoli before the Breeders' Cup Sprint at Santa Anita. That horse had one of the fastest Steve Asmussen workouts you will ever see, ever. And I knew right then that race was over. And that was a tough field that year, too. I'm going, they're not beating off that work. They're not beating Matoli. Forget it. And I'm not that confident in Disarm, no. But this workout was so un-Asmussen-like, it makes me really look at him as someone that's going to come in here. You know, he ran a good enough race in that Louisiana Derby. You know, he's going to come in here fresh. I think the distance isn't going to be a real problem for him with his breeding and everything, his running style. I know they were high on him. You know, one of the reasons I wasn't quite as high on Disarm earlier is because I kept telling our friend Ryan Stillman, how can we feel he's the Kentucky Derby winner when he's not even the best horse in Asmussen's barn? Because you know who I think that is. That's Extra Anejo. So if you like Extra Anejo, I'm not going to get all that hot and bothered about Disarm when he's at the best second fiddle to Extra Anejo. But then Extra Anejo went out of the picture. Disarm's in the picture. That horse, very intriguing to me for all the people betting the exotics, looking for a horse underneath, because he's going to be a good price. You can bet on that. He's got to be 20, 30 to 1. How could he not be? And that horse for 20 or 30 to 1, you know, and see, once you are a shot to hit the board, it's like Rich Strike. If you can hit the board, then you've got a, outside shot to actually win it. So, I mean, like, would I be floored if Disarm won it? I'd be surprised. Yes, I would be surprised. I'm not going to be surprised if he hits the board. And because of that, I wouldn't be like totally shocked if he happened to pull off the win. Think of that if that turned out to be Asmus. He loses last year with Epicenter and comes back with Disarm, who nobody's paying any attention to, and wins the Kentucky. And the way he's acting and talking about that horse. I know they were high on him last year at Saratoga. And the way he's talking out of this workout and everything, I mean, I've seen enough signals from that guy and everything that I can see when he feels he's maybe going to sneak up on everybody here. So that is a horse definitely to me to keep an eye on in this race. And it just shows you how wide open this is, because he's not the only one. I mean, this is truly a wide open Derby this year.
Yeah, I mean, but past, if you're going to go past these, the top shooters or whatever you want, past that, it's like, to me, it's like you could throw in a Disarm, you could throw in, a Mage or, whatever it is. Like, could they get up for second, third, fourth? Sure. I mean, Sun Thunder, I don't know. I mean, why not, right? It's like, to me, it's like they're all past the top tier. They're all kind of the same. I mean, really. I mean, they all have had their kind of nice races, or the ones where like, maybe.
Well, I've talked about my friend, and I've worked alongside him for many, many years, and we've bet sports, we've bet racing, and so forth. That's Kurt Hoover, and I see on Betfair TV that FanDuel TV, I see Confidence Game is his top pick. Now, at first, I go like, but I didn't hear everything he said, but he has such respect for Keith DeSormo, and I do too. I first got to know Keith in 2000 when I was working at Lone Star Park and Publicity for 1 year. That guy had the top 2-year-old on the grounds. And I'm going to tell you, when I would go to that guy's barn, he was so articulate. He is so sharp. That guy, and look what he's done. Here's Baffert and Pletcher and Chad Brown and Cox getting these horses 400,000, 800,000, 1.2 million, 3 million, whatever. Here's Keith DeSormo. Oh, this horse costs 40,000. He costs 27,000, whatever. He gets horses like Exaggerator and so forth, Texas Red. This guy is so sharp. He got this for Confidence Game. And 25. On the bottom side, who's in that family? A sibling to Zenyatta. Right there. Think of that. And he got this horse for like practically nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And listen, you talk about unorthodox, but he knows this horse. He said right off the bat, I may train him up to the Kentucky Derby. So it wasn't like this was a last minute audible. He said this was a possibility from the get-go. And believe me, this horse may have, especially if the track's off, because he's already shown he likes it. What if he's a wet track freak? Right there could make him the winner, possibly. So there's a horse. I was going to say, is he on anybody's radar? Well, I know one guy's radar. It's on Kurt Hoover's radar. He's not on my radar, but he's not one. It's like where I say, I can't possibly picture that. Because I do have a lot of respect for that trainer right off the bat, right there. And obviously this horse has some ability. And, but a 10-week layoff. But listen, we've seen some wacky stuff as it is. We saw a horse win that didn't run at 2, just for starters. We saw a horse scratch in off the eligible list to win. Is a 10-week layoff any wackier than scratching in off of the also eligible list, or not running as a 2-year-old, or some of the other things that we've seen in the Kentucky Derby? So, is it impossible? No way it's impossible. It's not as good as that horse is, not as good as his trainer is. And again, if it happens to rain, which it could. So, you make the point, Jared, you can really go down that list and deep this year. You really, really can. For instance, Mage. And some of these, you just have to make the decision. If they win, I lose. Mm-hmm. See, for me, that's Mage.
Yep.
Because I don't think he has enough seasoning. I think he's very talented. I loved his move on the far turn. But again, the fact if he was the horse, I think, good enough to win the Kentucky Derby, he should have beaten Forte in the Florida Derby. So that tells me a lot. He couldn't finish that deal. But he's lightly raced. Obviously, he's very talented. It wouldn't shock me, but it's without me. Forte, I put in the same boat as Mage. Honestly, the difference is Mage is going to be a long shot. Forte's probably the favorite. But honestly, if Forte wins, I lose for this Kentucky Derby. It's just that simple.
Yep.
And I have several bets in the all others in the first 3 Kentucky Derby future pools. Remember, guys, the first Kentucky Derby future pool for this Derby was before the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. So I've got out of their, and they had 40, 38 individual horses on that. Out of those 38, Forte is one of the only few left. There aren't many. It's like a very handful of horses. And it's the same from Pool 2 that was also in November and Pool 3. I was in, so I actually got 3 to 5, then 4 to 5, and then 3 to 5 again on the all others. And that I've got enough wagers on there that even if Practical Move doesn't win, Kings Barnes doesn't win, I'm going to make money on the Kentucky Derby this year just off of my all others bets, unless Forte wins. Which means I'm going to monitor that to see what my loss profit situation is and could possibly bet Forte to get some money back. It would cut down my profit to some extent, but I'm willing. And the good thing for me is because Forte doesn't look like a 6 to 5 shot here. If he is 5 to 2, 3 to 1, 7 to 2, and as I say, with those long shots getting more play, who knows? Maybe 4 to 1 or something. Let's say he's 7 to 2 or 4 to 1, I can step in there and make a fairly big bet on him and still be then I'm really in a position to where whatever happens, I'm going to show a profit. So that's my next thing that I'm having to, as a gambler, I'm having to watch closely, because pretty much anybody that other than Forte, this year's Kentucky Derby, I have set myself up to win up to almost 17. And because of the Practical Move wasn't even like the first or second, he was an all other. No, I don't think he, maybe one of them he was, but again, those all others, because I've got practically everybody, I'm in a really enviable position there, because those prices were decent to me that far away, because I know how hard it is for a horse. I give Forte credit for that. He has gone from being the champion 2-year-old to the Kentucky Derby, which is an accomplishment in and of itself. It really is. And I admire him for that. So, and he's the one that would be like the horse that would cost me the most at this point. And so now I'm just putting myself in a position, if I can, to at least mitigate that and still make a profit on the day. But as it stands now, he would wipe me out, because I have nothing on him in anything. So, that's what can often happen in these Ds. I mean, when I've wheeled horses, when I was young, and you'd wheel a horse in the Daily Double, because that's all we had, guys, when I was young, the $2 Daily Double, race 1, race 2. There were no exactas, no superfectas, no trifectas, no pick this, pick that. No. Win, place, show, and the $2 double. So the $2 double was a huge deal. People would say, did you hit the double? Oh, I hit the double. It was like hitting the pick 6. And when I was a kid, it would cost me a lot of money. I might only have $26, $25. And so if I was wheeling at Longacres to a 12-horse field, a horse in the first race, it was $24. And I'd hit that first race. And then you look at the double payoffs, and the favorite would be pay, $18. You'd lose money. But then, everybody else, and you'd be rooting for big long shots, like a horse that pay $100 or $200, whatever. And it was amazing how often that darn horse that would pay $16 would win. Again, going back to Kurt Hoover, he would wheel the double a lot. And I started telling him, tell me when you do that so I can go bet the favorite. Because it happened to him. He would wheel, and like 9 times, it seems like 9 times out of 10, 8 times out of 10, the chalk, you can just put it in the bank. And I told him, I said, if you're going to do that, please let me know, because that way I'll even give you a little of my profit.
All right, John. Dude, this has been the comments have been crazy. Everyone's loving every second of this because we don't have John live on here ever. This is the first time we've ever had John live on Thinkers Off. And seriously, thank you so much for being here. I mean, I think the take on Practical Move is solid, giving me something to think about as well. It always does. Every time we have John on for these, I'm always like, I'll have my opinion, and John's on, I'm like, shit, now I've got to redo this. I got to kind of read because it gave me some stuff, and I'm sure others are thinking the same thing. So, John, thank you so much, and hey, good luck on your boy. Well, good luck on all of them, but hopefully Practical Move gets it done for you.
Well, thanks a lot, guys. And listen, one of the great things about this game is, listen, I've got my ear to the ground. I'm watching a lot of the stuff you guys are putting out, a lot of great stuff. I mean, and you guys have gotten experienced enough now. Your opinions carry a lot of weight with me. And again, you guys don't just, your blinkers off. And congratulations again on your milestone of that. I mean, it's such a great milestone that you reached. And, you guys go back and forth. You two guys especially, because playing off of each other, that's something Kurt Hoover and I got a lot of favorable feedback. We fed off of each other, very similar to you two guys. And this goes back to my early days, back with my dad or his friends. We would drive to a racetrack out of town, and we'd get our racing forms, go to the motel, we'd handicap individually, have dinner, and then sit down and go have our own seminar. And that's as educational as it gets. And you'd sit there and go, I think this horse will do this, or I like him because of that. And the key is keeping an open mind and letting a guy say, yeah, but I think, and you go, that's a good point. And as I say, watching the dudes and all that you guys put out leading up to the Kentucky Derby, all the Triple Crown races, and the Breeders' Cup, honestly. And Jared, I've told you this, and Aaron too, about your formerly the betting guy, but now the Bible. The thing I missed in the first Bible was not having the picks grid where you had everybody in there. And you guys have put together a really good team. I mean, you guys, and it's interesting for instance, Dr. Miranda was the only one that picked Practical Move in the San Felipe.
Yep.
See, I know that. I'm paying attention to that. Because that, and the thing, why am I paying attention to that? Because now she's gained some credibility with me. Look at how that turned out. And so when you have put out the Bibles, I'm looking at her picks with even more respect than before, because that was a heck of a pick. And the fact she was the lone one, I mean, nobody else gave him boo. And I had to make the morning line for that race, and he didn't get all that much respect in the betting in that race either. He got less respect than I made him on the line. So, I mean, what I'm saying is that it's great when you listen to other people's opinions, as long as there's something behind that opinion that makes sense. And you guys, when you go back over racing that's already been held, or looking ahead to racing that's going to be held, do such a good job. You really do. And it's not personal, and you guys have a good time doing it. You have fun. And that's another thing that kind of gets lost in racing sometimes. Everybody's so serious. This is one of the things that's made Bob Baffert so popular with owners. And the other owners and trainers it rubs some of those old crusty people the wrong way. He'll hold up the winning trophy, or put it on his head. But listen, there's so much losing in this sport.
Yeah.
That when you get a win, if you can't have some fun and celebrate and so forth, then this is one reason Baffert's, of course, the main reason Baffert's had the clients is his outstanding training ability. Believe me, this is no accident either. A lot of people don't understand. That guy, I know, he was stabled by Whittingham. And to me, Whittingham's the greatest trainer that ever lived. There's others that you can make a case for, but to me, it's Whittingham. And Baffert studied him like a hawk. He studied Las Barrera like a hawk. He studied Richard Mandela to this day. He can tell you about Whittingham's feed program, Barrera's feed program, Mandela's feed program. They're this, they're that, their approach, taking the horse. And to show you there's more than one way to be a successful trainer, Charlie Whittingham would get there like at 4 o'clock in the morning. And one reason he liked me and I got along with him is once in a while I would go out there and show up at his barn at like 4:30 before they even opened the track. And that carried so much weight with him that I was interested enough to show up then. Las Barrera, he didn't show up till like 7, 8 o'clock. One time, Charlie was really riding. I was standing there. He was really razzing Barrera. Now, these are two of the greatest trainers of all time. And Charlie's giving Barrera the business, and he says, you're a trainer. You should be out here earlier than when you get here, Laz, whatever. Laz just looked at Charlie and he says, Charlie, I'm a trainer, not a night watchman. And Barrera's way worked too. And Barrera would almost work. Let's say he was running a horse in this year's Kentucky Derby. He would have had, basically like from the Santa Anita Derby, probably in those days, 3 5-furlong works. And one time, because he almost always worked his horses 5 furlongs, whether it was for the San Juan Capistrano at about 1 3/4 or the Breeders' Cup Sprint, it'd be 5 furlongs. And I asked him once, I said, Lance, why are almost all your workouts 5, no matter the distance, turf or dirt? He said, I do that for the main reason that I know where I'm exactly at with that horse from a consistency standpoint. He says, I know if the horse struggled more in this 5 furlong work versus that 5 furlong work. And certainly the gallop outs were different. See, this is something that Bob Baffert and Todd Pletcher fool a lot of people. When a Baffert horse works 5 furlongs, it's really a 6 furlong work, almost maybe a lot of times a 7 furlong work, because they have them gallop out very good past where the official work ended. So there's so many ways to do this and so many different ways. That's part of what it's so fascinating. There isn't one set way. D. Wayne Lucas has, his way of doing things. And yet look at how successful he's been. And I mean, you can go right down. Now, the thing about Lucas is, like Pletcher does things it's pretty similar to Lucas. There's a good reason. He worked under him and studied under him and everything. And very kind of like the guys that came up under Whittingham were more like him, like Neil Drysdale. Now, there's another guy that in his prime would take a race, make it the target, and he could have losses for a horse on the way to the target. But when that horse ran the day of the target, the horse was unbeatable. And I'll tell you when it happened. 1984, the first Breeders' Cup. Princess Rooney was shipped to California and Neil Drysdale after being a star in Florida. And I talked to Neil Drysdale early in her stay here after maybe a couple of races. And Las Barrera had the top older distaffer at that time, Adored. And Adored was beating Princess Rooney. And I asked Drysdale one morning, we were walking back to his barn at Santa Anita, and I said, what did you think of her race and this and that? And he made a comment to me, again, it's what they say, how they say it. He said, what I'm doing with this filly is this. I guarantee you that the day she runs in that new thing they have, the Breeders' Cup, she will be running much better than she is right now. That's my goal for her. So what you're seeing now is not what you're going to be seeing from her at the end. And she ran in that Breeders' Cup, first distaff, and ran faster than Wild Again's time in the Classic. And Drysdale told me they considered running her in the Classic, And if she had, she would have won it. But that's how good Drysdale was coming out of the Whittingham School of that type of training. So it's just a wonderful game, guys. And like I say, thanks for all you guys do as the dudes, too.
You bet. Yeah. Jared had a school program, so he had to drop out on us, John. Like you said at the beginning, you got to be prepared for anything, right? So
That's right.
All right. Well, let's close it up here, John. Like Jared said, thanks so much for coming on. It was fantastic as always. One of our highest rated shows ever, John. So we really, really appreciate it. And listen, we're going to be rooting for Practical Move for you for sure, no doubt.
Well, I can use all the rooting I can get, but as they say, it is what it is. But like I say, I've been watching your top 5 all the way down the line. You had Forte number one for a long time.
Yeah.
And listen, you got Tapit Trice up there now, very understandable. And but on your final top 5, you moved Practical Move up a little there, dropped Dermo Sotogaki down. So,
yeah.
And that's what we've been doing. We've been juggling these horses, and people say, why do you do these lists? Well, it's just kind of fun, and it makes you really hone in on it. Puts your blinkers on. You got blinkers off, but that makes you put your blinkers on, because you have to focus on exactly everything what's going on. And especially, it isn't that you're just doing it for yourself. You're being accountable to the people that are watching you. The more successful you are, the more people are going to be interested in what you have to say. It's that simple. So, and as I say, you guys have built up a good credibility. Your whole team, not just you two, but your whole team. And I like looking in the Bible and seeing who everybody is picking. And when it comes to sports, I really have enjoyed kind of getting to know your father, Aaron. I mean, he's a chip off the old block. I love the guy. I feel like he's practically a second dad to me now, listening to him all the time and talk sports. And he's very knowledgeable on sports, whatever sport it is. But he's got a good sense of humor about it. And he's obviously been a very good sire too.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. I don't know about that much. You may have went too far with that last comment there, John. No, he's been popular for sure. We need to have John and myself and Papa Dude at Matt Denny's. That would be amazing. I don't know. We may not be allowed back though if we ever got that group together. That would be crazy.
Well, that would be very enjoyable for sure. Like I say, I've really enjoyed watching him, and he brings a very good opinion. Do I agree with him every time? No. Sometimes when I don't agree with him, he's right, and that's just the way it goes. But like I say, he's very knowledgeable, and Mike too. I mean, Mike's very savvy on the gambling. I know I could sit down with Mike Sonich and because of the fact that I got to know Len Bankers, one of the most famous gamblers in history. I mean, that guy had the right side on the Super Bowl for like 23 straight years in print. Yeah. I mean, and is a legend. He's dead now, but he was a legend in Las Vegas. I got to know him and read his book thoroughly. And I'm very savvy on a lot of the, I was fortunate to know Roxy Roxborough, who was kind of revolutionary in Vegas. He was the first guy that put out a line that would go to numerous sports books. Before Roxy Roxborough came around, each sports book put out their own line. Mm-hmm. And he was the guy that revolutionized that and started where they would all subscribe to him. And that way they were kind of a lot more on the same page. It made it to where you couldn't shop for prices as much. And then as technology got better, to where they're all in the computer and can see it. But I mean, going back to fax machines and stuff. And that's why Roxy was able to retire at a very early age, because he was way ahead of the game on that. And but as I say, Mike Sonich is very knowledgeable when it comes to numbers and gambling and prices and things. And it's enjoyable to hear him on Dudes That Bet Daily and his take on things. So it's very good. I would expect that show of yours to really grow as sports betting continues to expand across the country. Unfortunately, not in California, but it seems like we might be about the last one to get it, which is hard to believe. But the Indians have that much power in this state now that, and they don't want it because it'd be competition for the Indian casinos. That really kind of sums it up in a nutshell. But like I say, there's enough of that across the country now that you guys, I mean, talk hockey, talk college sports, talk the NBA, talk baseball, I mean, everything. It's just wonderful. And for people that like sports, and as I say, when I was in high school, I was writing a sports column, not a horse racing column, but there was a lot of horse racing that went into the column. But I wrote about that. In 1973, another prediction I made was the New York Knicks would win the NBA championship. And that one came through too. That was my favorite basketball team, even though I'm really a Laker. But that Knicks team with Willis Reed and Walt Frazier and Earl Perlmutter, Bill Bradley and Dave DeBusschere, and I mean that team. Phil Jackson was on that team, and I mean that team was such a team. You know, 2 or 3 guys could have an off game, and that team would win because it was such a team. The other guys would pick up the load, and that was just a phenomenal. That's why with Jackson, that he, you know, you had to really be a team player to play for Jackson because that came up under Red Holtzman. But you guys do such a good job talking. And the thing about Dudes Who Bet Daily, it isn't just sports. You also bring in the horse racing. So it's the best of both worlds.
Yeah, we try our best. Like I said, it's the odd couple of Samich and my dad. Like, couldn't be any different.
It really is, isn't it? Yeah, Felix and Oscar.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I know.
By the way, you remind me of one of my favorite things I ever saw on The Odd Couple, the TV show, where Oscar takes Felix to the horse races for the first time, and they're at the track. So Oscar's explaining win, place, and show. And that if you bet this horse to show, he can finish third. He can lose, and you're still going to make money. And Felix looks at Oscar and says, "What? Are you telling me I can bet a horse and it loses and I win?" And Oscar goes, "Yeah." And he goes, "And you've been losing all these years?"
Yeah, that sounds like something we might hear tomorrow, live on Dudes Who Bet Daily. Oh boy. All right. Wife's telling me I got to go to dinner, John. We got to get out of here one more time. Hey, listen, thanks so much for the kind words as well. That is really nice to hear. We feel like we're trying to bring on people, and you know, we've been lucky to get some good people. So I appreciate that very much.
You bet. Good to be with you, and good luck to everybody in this year's Kentucky Derby.
Yes, most importantly. All right, John, I'll make you go, or let you go make the morning line. You got morning lines to make, so.
Yes, I do for Sunday at Santa Anita.
All right. Thanks, John. I'll let you go.
Thanks a lot.
All right, guys. That was Jon White. As I'll wrap this up real quickly here and get going on to whatever else. What are we at? We're at 2 hours and 52 minutes. There was one comment. You guys' comments have killed me this whole time. There was this one really got to me. Kevin B said, the nice part for John, it's only 3 p.m. in there on the West Coast. Aaron is stressed because his wife is about to kill him being late for dinner. Yeah, there's been some texts going on. But yeah, but I love the comments. Just fantastic. You know, all joking aside, I mean, what a guy, right? And I can tell you guys with John, what you see on the show is what you get with him 24/7. I've told the story before. I'll never forget it. We were at Breeders' Cup the first time I met him, and he kind of told our mutual friend Ryan Stillman, he said, got 20, 30 minutes. I'm making the morning lines for the Breeders' Cup, and I'd love to meet him, you know. And so we went, and 8 hours later, there we were at Matt Denny's that he referenced, just still sitting there talking, you know. So that shows you just how good of a guy he is. And he'll sit there and talk to you forever. And listen, if we had the time, we could stay here till midnight and he'd still be going. So trust me, he's not out of stories. But anyway, all right, let's wrap this thing up. I don't really know what Jared says to wrap all this up. Maybe he'll come in and record something for the podcast version. But look, just to be clear, we got a ton of stuff going on this week. We've got videos, we've got podcasts, everything's going on for the Derby. We'll have live shows Monday through Saturday next week for the Derby. But yeah, that's it. That's it for Blinkers Off. Thank you guys very much for joining us. I'll try to find the music to play us off here. I feel very rested. I've got a lot of voice here, so maybe I should keep going. No, just kidding. All right, guys. We will see you next week for Blinkers Off. We'll see you right back here tomorrow morning for the Jon White approved Dudes Who Bet Daily. Thank you, everybody, for watching this. Thank you for all the comments. We'll see you next time.